The Joint Committee on Legislative Oversight on Columbia River Crossing will come to order. Welcome, everyone. Happy to see you all here this morning. A couple of procedural remarks. First, Representative Reed will be leaving us to go back to work in a couple of hours, so if he sneaks out the door, he's actually going back to work, not to the NCAAs, so don't anyone accuse him of that. Correct, Representative Reed?
Correct, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
And I think, Patrick, since you've helped arrange all this, why don't you share with everyone what we're doing today?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, today we have a series of panelists who are interested parties regarding the Columbia River Crossing project who are going to come present information and their views to the committee. Today we have some of that has been arranged by a few folks who are also going to kind of help keep things moving along, so there will be some of that going on behind the scenes as well. But we have everybody who's presenting to the committee informational testimony is listed on your agendas and on the agendas that are provided in the back of the room. Following, I think the plan with discussion with the committee chairs is that we'll bring folks up in panels of 2 to 4, and then it's the committee's plan, I believe, to wait until the end. Everybody at in the panel has presented their testimony. Then we'll do question and answer with the committee members, and then move on to the next panel. Several panelists have slide presentations. Those are going to be up on the side of the room. And then following the last of the panels, we're going to go to some folks with the CRC project to provide some response and also be available for questions in response to members' reactions to what they hear in the testimony. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Patrick. And just so, of course, the committee can ask questions if they like, but the idea, I think, is to try to get through each panel, hold our questions to the end of each panel, and move through, because if we don't keep moving, we will run out of time. Even though we do have 4 hours set aside for this, the initial thought is that we would take 2 to 2.5 hours for the listed presentations and then work our way into a more detailed discussion. So with that, Representative Frederick, would you like to proceed?
Thank you very much. I get to go first. You get to go first. Mr. Chair, on behalf of everyone in the Smart Bridge Coalition, many, many thanks for today's opportunity. My role is to keep our folks on time and on target.
And your name?
Joe, I'm sorry, Joe Smith.
Thank you.
And I am not serving as Jefferson's intern.
Happy to hear it.
And for my folks, I will let them know I don't have a hook. But when I show that,
Thank you.
you got a minute left. When I show that, you got 30 seconds left. And after that, I'm going to look very nervous. So please move right along. And our first witness is Lou Frederick, who of course needs no introduction except perhaps to say we are sitting in his legislative district, and I'm proud to have him as my representative.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm State Representative Lou Frederick. This is District 43. Welcome. And I have a few things that I'd want to talk about. The first thing is I'm not sure where the current plan stands in the light of the Coast Guard information, so I'm waiting to hear more information about that. But my concern is really a basic one, and it's put this way: what are the problems that really need to be solved? Where is the answer to each one of those problems? Is better access for I-5 commuters from Clark County high on that list? Because it seems to be reflected as a priority in the plan. Is reduction of congestion leading to delays in air pollution in Northeast Portland high on that list? Because it does not seem to be reflected as a priority of the plan. Is movement of freight high on that list? Because it seems to me that there are several components that would be addressed more completely in the plan if that were in fact a priority. Why, for example, is there no discussion of changing the railroad bridge to help with barges on the river, freight between the ports, and high-speed rail to downtown Portland? Now, I'm not here to be a knee-jerk naysayer. I want changes in how we move people and stuff through and into and out of North and Northeast Portland in particular. I want infrastructure that will serve that function for many years to come, not to address the problems of the past century. But I think this planning should be grounded in a clear list of priorities. And my priorities are these, in order. Address pollution in neighborhoods affected by I-5 and I-84. Pollution from internal combustion engines in my legislative district is horrendous, and we have the incidence of asthma and other chronic respiratory diseases to prove it. It is no accident that the freeway was built through historically poor and minority communities, and I have not seen evidence that this plan under consideration will make people's lives better in my district. And a short-term promise of construction jobs, even if I believe that the workers in my district would get those jobs, does not justify the long-term health effects of continuing to bring pollution into these neighborhoods. The plan has to include credible evidence that it will improve air quality. Facilitate the movement of freight. This is both one of the historical justifications for the interstate highway system and an important justification for addressing traffic bottlenecks in Portland. This is not only a question of whether there are delays for truck traffic moving between points south and north. It means looking at the entire system of freight movement and how goods are moved up and down the river, into and out of the port, into and out of the airport, into and out of the rail yards, as well as how trucks move through the region. Moving people, number 3, moving people who are traveling into and out of the region by car, plane, or train. Number 4, I believe that commuter traffic should be last on the list. The fact is that we increasingly need to plan our built environment and our commercial environment to minimize routine commuting. The local, regional, and global environment demands that kind of planning. The only way that a freeway interchange plan that facilitates commuter traffic remains useful is if our efforts to reduce routine commuting are unsuccessful, and that would be a tragic failure. Referring back to my first priority, my constituents currently pay with their health for the convenience of Clark County commuters, and that has gone on long enough. So my expectation is that we will look at all alternatives in a comprehensive, structured way with a well-defined set of priorities and goals to measure those alternatives against. I also think those priorities and goals cannot stop at the southern end of the bridge. Homes, schools, businesses in my district will continue to bear an unfair burden of pollution and associated illness if the congestion is just moved south to the area between the Fremont and the Markham bridges. So, if this plan is implemented, whose life will be better? Whose life will be worse? Who will fail to improve? If the CRC project is successful, what will it look like for the environment, for commerce, for residents? And frankly, these questions have to be answered on behalf of the entire region, but especially on behalf of those who live and breathe in North and Northeast Portland. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative.
Clark County Commissioner Tom Mielke served 8 years on the Washington Legislature's Transportation Committee, sits on the Regional Transportation Council and CTRAN Board, and is active in the Economic Transportation Alliance. We especially appreciate his presence to offer a looking south perspective.
Thank you very much. I'd like to appreciate and thank the board for being here. I can really relate to where you are. One of the things I want to talk about is institutional.
Your name.
I'm sorry. My name is Tom Mielke, Clark County Commissioner. I'm here in behalf of myself and my experience. I want to relate to some of the things that you, as elected representatives, to do. I want to talk about institutional knowledge. And one of the things that I really see a disadvantage of is term limits. I sat on 8 years of transportation in the state of Washington. 1998, we came down and we met with all the delegation in the House and the Senate and from Oregon and from Washington and from all of our staff and both DOTs. And we met upstairs in the train depot down there. We talked about I-5. We talked about problem solving that congestion to make that air cleaner for the people that are in that corridor. After 5 hours of deliberation, we came to the conclusion the corridor was at near capacity in 1998. By their own admission with the new project being proposed, it will not remove congestion as we expect it or know it to be. Therefore, you still haven't solved one of those problems. I come from the trucking industry. For 18 years, I owned a trucking company and worked across the state lines. It would be terribly intrusive and expensive to the shipper and the consumer if this was to go on with tolls. After I left the legislature, I need to back up a little bit. It's really funny, you know, with the term limits and the way it affects you, one thing I did notice that if you want to know what's going on, go back and talk to your staff, because your staff have been here longer than most elected people because of the term limits. Ironically enough, in the state of Washington, the Secretary of Transportation now is Paula Hammond. She was staff for the House Transportation. And I reminded her here a while back when they came down that she was there. She should remember that what we did on this conclusion and that we needed to look for a new corridor, a new way to get across. We're saying that we need not only one bridge, we probably need two bridges, but the I-5 corridor is probably at capacity today. After I left the legislature, I continued to look at transportation issues because that's where my heart was. I, along with others, helped create and joined and worked on an Economic Transportation Alliance group, a private group that's still going today, which is now known as Third Bridge Now. Looking back on 2020, you'll go back and you say, oh, why in 2002 did all of a sudden the state of Washington, unbeknownst to us legislators, decided that the best person to be in charge of transportation was going to be our governor? When you get closer to the people as your state representatives, you become more accountable. As a state governor, you're not quite as responsible because you're not that close. So one of the things that we get involved in is that we have to answer to the people. We have to do it. And when you don't have the institutional knowledge, you lose track of sight of what's going on. But what they did in 2002, we voted and put the governor in charge because we wanted to do better. I did not vote for that. Simultaneously, I learned years later, the state of Oregon did the same thing. They made the governor in charge. This thing has been steered from the very, very top, and it's very, very hard to make them more accountable. Now we're up to the point and to that moment of aha, and that's where we are today. And in closing, I want to say, aha, we now have documentation of what we've been saying for so long by your Oregon Supreme Court, identifying what the intent of this was to put light rail into Clark County, and they knew they couldn't sell it. So the big caveat was a bridge that was 3 times more than the light rail project itself. Now we have another aha in their haste to shove this down our throats. They skipped over another regulating commodity, which is our Coast Guard and the Corps of Engineers. And I think that when you look back and you look at the haste and the history and the institutional knowledge that's been involved in here, and I'm sure a lot of your staff are still here, they know where we were and they know the corridor is at capacity. A new bridge, it doesn't matter if it's 6 lanes or 16 lanes, will not remove congestion. It will back up from the Rose Quarter. And thank you very much for listening to us today.
Thank you, Commissioner. Do we have another member of our panel? Go ahead, Mr. Smith.
George Crandall is a principal in Crandall Arambula, an award-winning urban design, planning, and architecture firm located in Portland. The firm, with a focus on revitalizing cities, works throughout the U.S. and Canada. Ideally, George would be presenting later when we get to alternatives, but he has to leave town later this morning, so we have moved him up.
Mr. Crandall, if you could move that microphone over in front of you there, thank you.
I will do that, and thank you very much, Joe. We have the computer going here, but we don't have it connected to the screen. We don't have the screen connection. Oh, there we go. And may we have the lights out over here, please? Thank you, so you can all see that. My name is George Crandall, and I think it's always helpful to, if it's not the CRC, what might it be? Now, there are a number of alternatives. This is one alternative that's been developed after looking at the statement of needs, recognizing there is a need, and this is one of many ways to go, and this one works. And so, CRC, here it is, 4 miles of freeway, about a mile of bridge. You're all familiar with that scheme. There are a couple of engineering fundamentals that we need to talk about, and one has to do with traffic distribution. And so if you have multiple crossings, this is downtown Portland, and you can see 4 bridge crossings, you get the traffic distributed in the downtown. If you have a single crossing, one bridge, you remove those other 3 bridges, and you consolidate your traffic. Of course, you get more cars in one place, and you get the interchange problems at either end, and you get a severe impact zone, congestion, noise, and air quality. So that's fundamental with consolidated traffic. And so the single crossing is similar to the CRC. The multiple crossings would be similar to the CSA. And schematically, it looks like this. CRC, 1 bridge, CSA, 3 crossings. Another engineering fundamental has to do with freeway splicing. I was a project manager for the Mount Hood Freeway study. We prepared the EIS. I was in charge of trying to figure out how to fit this big road, and this is, you can look out and see Clinton and Division, this big road into downtown Portland. And the dirty little secret was we never could. We couldn't take that big road and attach it to Portland's freeway system. There was really no way to do it. Fortunately, the governor, the mayor had the courage to pull a plug on it and transfer those funds to other transportation projects which solved the problem. We have a similar situation with the CRC in that it is feeding into the Portland freeway system. And engineers who have worked on this call me up in the middle of the night and they say it's equivalent to attaching a garden hose to a fire hydrant. So why is that? Well, the CRC at its widest point is 22 lanes going down to 10 lanes. The Portland garden hose is 4 to 6 lanes. And so you automatically have the congestion and the stoppage where you make that connection. The solution, of course, would be to change that garden hose into a fire hose, all the way not into Portland, but through Portland as well, if the CRC was to operate efficiently. The independent review panel in 2010 made this statement. You have to demonstrate how these projects fit together and come up with a scheme. The estimate at the time was just to solve the Rose Quarter rebuild would be about $1.3 billion. This doesn't include the I-405 connection as well. So those are fundamentals. The common sense alternatives respects those and develops a 3-bridge solution. Bridge 1 is to maintain the existing bridge, and you will hear people say, well, it's not safe. The bridge is safe. This is from Don Wagner, the regional administrator in Washington. It's structurally solid. The crossings are safe. A seismic upgrade study was completed by engineers in 2006, and it's technically feasible to make it the safest bridge in the state of Oregon, and that retrofit would cost about $125 to $265 million. Second bridge is a new local bridge. Going over to Hayden Island, it would carry autos in transit, bikes, and pedestrians. The third bridge is a new bridge, it would carry rail and road alongside the existing rail bridge. It would carry commuter rail, high-speed rail, and which would then connect on down to Portland Union Station. It would also carry trucks. It would be a truck bypass, and where you see that gray-brown line, that is the truck bypass. Trucks then could move from one side of the river to the other, from port to port, without ever being on the I-5 bridge. The existing rail bridge carries 65 freight trains and 12 passenger trains a day. It is at capacity, and we will need a new rail bridge in any case to carry commuter rail and high-speed rail. Barges are often given, river traffic is given as a reason for building the CRC, and we know studies have been completed that there is a 70-foot clearance under the existing I-5 span, and if a new lift span is placed in the middle of the existing rail bridge, about 90% of the lifts can be avoided on I-5. It will take that new lift span, will take care of those 525 lifts, leaving about 48 lifts a year or 1 a week, which can be done after hours for vessels over 70 feet in height. That's a solution. That is the fix. The cost is about $100 million. It's on record. It's being supported from the agencies that you see listed here. Cost and phasing. Well, there are many ways this could be phased. And to solve the I-5 lift problem, the new railroad bridge lift could be in Phase 1. Phase 2 could be that local connection over to Hayden Island to solve some of the congestion problems on I-5, would handle that local traffic. Phase 3 could be that new commuter high-speed rail truck bridge to handle the freight and eventually the commuter and high-speed rail. And Phase 4 could be then the connection from Hayden Island then over to Vancouver, carrying traffic transit bikes, that local connection as well, relieving then traffic on I-5. And then finally, the seismic upgrade could be made to the existing bridge. Now, maybe a contingency is needed. Let's assume for a moment that there is a seismic event even after the upgrade on I-5 and the bridge needs to be replaced. What do? There is and I'll hit that in the next slide, but if we total up those costs for those first 5 phases, it's $1.8 billion. It's half the cost of the CRC at $3.6 billion. Now, the existing bridge, as I was saying, if it needs to, at some point, has to be replaced because of a seismic event or something else, it's possible to do it this way. And they'll tell you you can't put in this kind of a bridge on an interstate freeway. This is I-95 in the District of Columbia, the main north-south arterial then on the East Coast. So we could do this and maintain the profiles of the existing bridge, 70 feet, which would allow barges to get under it, and then for anything larger, this kind of a bascule detail. Comparative evaluation of these 2 alternatives. Same number of road lanes, 10 and 10. And Gerald Fox is going to be talking about this shortly. It has more peak hour capacity. And you see existing I-5 on the left, the CRC in the middle, the CSA then, common sense alternative on the right, more capacity. If we look at the CRC needs statement that was used to drive the CRC process, it's possible to do a quick evaluation. The CSA beats it on every count, and we could go through each one of these. It's not worth doing now, but it's very easy to justify this kind of an evaluation. The CSA beats the CRC on every count, and if we add things like construction jobs, local auto access, response to global warming, construction cost, it beats it again on every count. CRC management, you asked this, I think, and an email came in, what do you think about the CRC management? Well, we haven't been part of that management. All we do is read the newspapers, and these are sequential. We find that we have the wrong design for the bridge, that the congestion is not relieved, job creation is a tenth of the claims, traffic projections are inflated, the financing plan is not realistic, the bridge is not high enough. We have to conclude there's some management problems with this project. Schedule and next steps, finally. This is what we think the construction schedule would be for the CRC. We think this is probably what will happen. There will be litigation, and this project will go dark because it is so flawed. The CSA, for example, Phase 1 could be under construction as soon as the CRC if it had a green light and if the money was there and if it was moving ahead. So the next steps then we would like to see is no more planning funding for the CRC, no acquisition of properties, and to study affordable alternatives. And so the CRC should not be built because the CSA and other alternatives are cheaper, they are faster, and they are better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Crandall. Questions for this panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could we return to the schedule for a moment? I'm thinking about a meeting I was in just yesterday. The Oregon Passenger Rail Leadership Council and feeling frustrated by how long it would take to come up with an alternative for a passenger rail alignment. And when I look at the schedule that you had mentioned, I'm concerned about how much time you've allowed for basically starting over. And is this the amount of time appropriate for evaluation planning and an FEIS? It seems particularly ambitious and much more so than much smaller projects. So could you comment on the amount of time you've allocated for starting over and doing planning? And also, I'd like to understand what kind of litigation you would anticipate. And
I think others will talk about the litigation, the probable litigation, but the first thing in moving a project forward is to get consensus from the various stakeholders. And once you have that, and you have the environmental community behind you, and you have the activists with you, you can move these projects very, very quickly. The problem with a project like the CRC is it runs on forever, as you know, because there is very limited support for the project. So these projects can be accelerated, they can move quickly if there is consensus. And for instance, when we talk about the CSA Phase 1, we are talking about the lift in the railroad bridge. Now that could be, frankly, that could be done much faster than what you see on this schedule. So we, in fact, are extending this on out. This project could start sooner. That lift should be installed in any case. And so you have immediately, you solve many of the congestion issues on I-5 because you now don't have to do all of those lifts. And you create jobs immediately. So this is probably longer. We are trying to be very conservative here. When we talk about that Phase 1, it wouldn't take this amount of time if there was consensus that it should be done in any case.
thank you.
Thank you.
Coach Byer.
Thank you. Mr. Crandall, I'm curious about a couple of things in your design, the truck bridge, the 3, which I assume is a new bridge. How would you move truck traffic off of the freeway and then back onto the freeway again? Seems like you're not changing the pattern of impact on the bridge, you're just shifting it onto a different one unless you're addressing just the between the port traffic there. And then in the construction design, what would be the impact on the railroad bridge if you're trying to modify that? Does that require during the construction, a shutdown of the rail bridge?
The existing railroad bridge, I am not sure what it would take to do that lift. All I can tell you is that all of the agencies and the railroads endorse that. They know they can do that, and we're assuming they could do it without any major disruption in traffic. As far as the trucks, it doesn't mean that the trucks would not be able to use I-5. And so trucks could continue to use I-5, but they have this bypass. In other words, if they want to, they're coming down I-5 and they want to get to the port of Portland, and there is congestion on the bridge, they can take this alternative route and across the river and access their port destinations in Oregon. The same thing going north. They could use I-5 or they can use their bypass. So it is just multiple options for them to ensure that they are not delayed. So
Doesn't that require some additional road improvements, new roads, new property acquisition around I assume along Marine Drive on the Oregon side, and I'm not exactly sure what it does on the Washington side.
and you're right, it would, and that is included in the cost. There is considerable acquisition, there are considerable acquisition costs associated with the CRC. They would be much lower, though, because the bridges are smaller. The access requirements are not the same as with the 22 lanes that you have with the CRC. So you're right. But it is the same as the many bridges coming across the Willamette River into Portland. The access on either end is handled differently on each one, but they are small scale.
So from a property owner perspective, there's still going to be an ox that's going to get gored. It's just somebody else's ox.
I think that is always the case, but the point is that if there is a consensus alternative you can move there in a hurry. And I think that's what we're all looking for.
Senator Thompson.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Co-Chair, Mr. Crandall. Just, you mentioned it a second ago, and I think you answered my question, but the 1.8 billion estimate, that includes the road improvements and all the interchange work that these 3 bridges would require?
Yes, and now these are our conceptual estimates. You know, we have been paid nothing to put this together, not the $150 million that the consultant team has. We have used their cost, however. And so these costs are highly realistic based on information that has been developed by the CRC team. So we are doing rounding, but in most cases, we're very conservative. And if anything, we have upped them over what we would, the cost estimates we're finding in other documents. Thank you.
Senator Morse.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Crandall, for this presentation. I'm curious, what has been the process with the state of Washington? Have you made this same presentation to respective bodies? And if so, what response have you gotten on that side of the river?
I have not made the presentation on the Washington side of the river. However, a video was prepared by a very talented young man, and it is online, it is on YouTube, and I know that many people in Washington State have looked at that, and the common sense alternative is summarized in that video. But I have not made this presentation.
This is a follow-up, Mr. Co-Chair. Could you address the timing of your concepts and when they have been presented? I'm trying to put this in perspective because a lot of water has gone under the bridge. And when did this specific concept emerge?
This concept emerged a couple of years ago, and it was when a group of activists came together and said, look, there is a problem with this road, and is there an alternative, and is there one that will work, because there is a need here. There's no question about that, and something needs to be done. So it was basically 2 years ago, and I was looking at the presentations, and I have all of those, and they've been updated, and we have had many people who are experts in the area come on in and advise us and provide the information. So this is a compilation of many minds, many talented people over a period of a couple of years. Now, well over probably a year ago, we went down and we presented to the governor's staff, but we've never presented to the governor. We have tried to present to the mayor of Portland, and we have never been able to get to the mayor of Portland, and we've just been able to get staff. And so what we have found is that many of the decision makers have really been locked into the CRC and have not been all that open to standing back and taking a look at other possibilities, which is not unusual for a project of this size with this amount of money involved.
Thank you.
Representative Doherty.
Thank you very much. I have some questions about the railroad bridge. Who has the authority over railroad bridges? Are those property of the rail companies? Are they public? Are they private?
Yeah, I'm not an expert, and if I tried to answer that, it would probably be the wrong answer. What we know is that if you want to mess with the railroad, you need to be pretty careful. And
because my question with the new railroad bridge is who has the authority, who has the design finality of it, who maintains it, everything else.
You should know, however, that the new lift was vetted with the railroads, and they have agreed that this would be a great help and they could do this. So the railroads are on board for the new lift in the middle of the existing rail bridge.
But my question is, who owns the rail bridge? Is it public or is it private by the railroad?
Burlington Northern.
Burlington owns it.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, whoever.
Representative Ayer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Representative Frederick and then 2 questions for you, if I might. My first question, Representative, is you had mentioned some of your concerns and the impact to the local community. Are they alleviated at all by an alternative such as this?
As I've talked with folks in my neighborhood and the neighborhood associations, in looking at the railroad bridge in particular and that particular idea, that takes a lot of the truck traffic that's going through. It puts it in a particular, over into the port rather than just going straight through and staying on I-5. There's been some belief that that might take some of the congestion, some of the pollution out of that area as a result of that. These particular proposals really speak to at least some ideas, but they don't address completely the concerns that go from, frankly, from right just a few blocks from where we are right now, I-84 all the way up. We have congestion. If you've ever tried to get through here in the evenings, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It is clogged up, and all of that sits in a nice trench and comes up into this neighborhood and further north. So all of these things are, none of these completely address the issues that we're talking about, but without even thinking about it. I mean, the CRC doesn't seem to address that at all.
Thank you, Representative. Two questions now for Mr. Crandall. The first one is, if we were to go to an alternative, whether it's the common sense alternative or some other one, is there any translatable goodwill in the investment that Oregonians and Washingtonians have made to date in the growing number of $140+ million that's been spent to date? Is there goodwill in the work that's been done there that can be used for an alternative?
The answer is yes, because a lot of technical information has been collected, and that body of knowledge then can be used to move forward. And typically, what we do in cases like this, we say, we'll call that phase one. Now let's do phase two. We've learned a lot from phase one. There are some issues, there are some problems. We know we can do better, and that is in phase two, and we will use that body of knowledge. And so it's important to characterize it not as a mistake, but as a learning experience with a lot of great information developed that can be carried forward.
Thank you. And a follow-up, thank you. One other question is, because we will hear some rebuttal, and I understand you're leaving early, I wanted to know when this was introduced, this specific alternative, when it was introduced in the process, and why was it dismissed, from your perspective? And do you agree or disagree with those positions?
I wasn't at the beginning of the CRC, and others may be able to speak, I think, have more knowledge of that. I understand that this kind of an approach was dismissed very early in the game, and there were some very, kind of a very quick vote. And I don't think at the time that people had the information that they needed to move forward. And it's not unusual because everyone understood there was a problem. Everyone was of goodwill, wanted to move ahead, and it sounded like, well, if we just take care of this bridge, it will solve the problems. We have learned since that that's not the case. So I think that when alternatives were considered in the beginning, they probably did not have enough information to make the decision that they made at the time, and these kinds of alternatives were dismissed too quickly. I think the need statement as well was probably defective, and in that, Lou talked about many of the things that were left out of the need statement. And this whole thing about dividing up responsibility. We have the road guys and we have the railroad guys, and they are really often not together on these kinds of projects. And so this whole issue of commuter rail that we are going to require, and we will require a new bridge, was never really looked on as an opportunity then for exploring increasing the number of crossings to distribute the traffic, so you'd minimize the impact then that the Columbia River crossing is having today. So it was partly, I think, a compartmentalization of responsibilities. It was partly the thought that this would rather be a simple problem to solve, and we're just more knowledgeable today than we were then.
Thank you.
No further questions for this panel. Thank you very much, Representative Commissioner and Mr. Crandall. And I want to welcome Representative Sheehan, who joins us. Although not a member of this committee, he is a member of the Transportation House Committee, so we're happy to have you here.
Our next witness is Will Mock, who is a PSU professor of urban planning and development, mixed-use developer, widely published writer, lecturer, and international attorney. In former years, he served as an aide to both Senators Robert Kennedy and Jacob Javits, and he will provide us an overview.
While this is loading, I can actually answer a couple of the questions that you had before, Senator Byers' question with respect to the lift span of the rail bridge. When the St. John's Rail Bridge was done, it took 3 days.
Excuse me, your name?
My name is Will Mock, Professor of Urban Planning and Development at Portland State University. When the rail bridge was done at St. John's, the lift span was built off-site, and it took 3 days out of service to install it. So that can be done very quickly. And to answer Representative Brewer's comment, early in the process, the corridor was narrowed from the rail to I-5 to just I-5 corridor. So any solution which went farther west than I-5 was ruled out of order. My task here today is to give you an overview of the problem and some of the alternatives. You've heard one of the alternatives now out of order, but I want to talk to you and put all of this into perspective and talk about the scale of the problem first. And if you look at the two photographs there of downtown Vancouver and downtown Portland, each as depicted there, they're each the same size, each about 380 city blocks. But Vancouver has a single bridge across the river connecting it to Portland, whereas Portland has 7 bridges in that span alone, as well as 3 more, 1 north and 2 south. And I ask you, with respect to economic vitality, how vital would downtown Portland be without 6 of those bridges if the only connection between the 2 sides of the river was the freeway Markham Bridge alone? That's the situation that we have. And when you look at it in context, I-5 bridge congestion shows that in this bridge influence area, the yellow oval there on the left part of the screen, 70 to 80% of the traffic either enters or exits in that bridge influence area. And 30 to 40% of the traffic both enters and exits in that bridge influence area. So what that means is that 1/3, 2 of the 6 lanes going across it serve only as arterials. And so the principal source of congestion is not the freeway bridge capacity, but rather its location. And that is that all corridors funnel to a single point, as you can well see in the map on the lower right. Portland and Vancouver is a single urban entity, and its economic health suffers from a single clogged artery. And a single replacement artery, no matter how high, no matter how wide, or expensive or beautiful, will not restore its health. And if you impose a toll, the only one in the region, which will be economically equivalent to a tariff between the states, it would pinch that artery and impede the free flow of commerce and labor and capital between the cities and the states. Furthermore, the CRC does not solve the road congestion problem because all CRC traffic still must funnel to that very same single point. There still can be only 3 through lanes because that's the configuration of the freeway both north and south. And the 4 arterial corridors on the north and south sides of the river still will not connect. Nor will the CRC solve very important river and rail congestion problems. And the major navigation problem, as you saw in George's presentation, is not caused by the bridge height or the demand for lifts. It's caused by the fact that the lift span and the swing span do not align. And so those reverse S-curves have to be done in dangerous high wind and water conditions. Why is this important? Well, the freight capacity of a single barge is equivalent to 35 rail car freight capacity, or 116 trucks. So it's very important to the freight capacity of the region. And the rail hub that you see circled in the yellow oval on the right is the busiest Northwest rail hub in the Northwest between north-south and east-west traffic. And so all of this means that the CRC requires a Goldilocks solution. The bridge can't be too low or it would impede river traffic. It can't be too high or it will impede air traffic. If it's not low enough, it can't fit under the railroad berm. If it's not high enough, it can't fit over the railroad traffic. And if it's too far east, it'll infringe upon the historic reserve. And if it's too far west, it'll infringe upon downtown Vancouver, but it can't stay where it is because it would stop all traffic to rebuild it exactly in its current location. Not only is it inappropriate, it is the most expensive solution. Well, why is that so? Well, first of all, it destroys the true economic value of two viable existing bridges. The replacement bridge must be higher and wider and longer and flatter than all of the alternatives. They require the maximum number of acquisitions of property of full over 300 takings and elimination of 916 jobs. It requires massive and very expensive rebuilds of 5 interchanges. It causes long and costly disruptions to traffic and business in excess of 9 years. And so if you put all the Goldilocks eggs into one basket, that increases both costs and risks. And complexity is what causes cost overruns, and surely there will be some. Who will pay for those? We've already spent $145 million in addition to having the $60 million more committed, and all that we have to show for it is a single unbuildable plan, unbuildable according to what the Coast Guard says. There are balanced and more cost-effective and smarter solutions. All of the alternatives retain and improve the existing I-5 bridges. They replace the BNSF swing span with a lift span aligned with the I-5 long span. They build a West Road rail bridge adjacent to the railroad bridge, which connects downtown Vancouver to Marine Drive and North Portland Road. And they would have between 2 and 4 arterial lanes plus 2 rail tracks. The result is that you get at least 2 crossings, 3 in the case of the CSA, and most of them are at about half of the cost of the CRC itself. So there are good money reasons to do it. Why can it be cheaper? Well, the replacement spans to the west are lower and shorter bridge spans. In fact, the river, as you can see in this photograph, is 531 feet narrower at this location. And less expensive bridge types can be used. The infrastructure which exists can be used. The projects can all be phased, reducing construction disturbance and delays and costs. They eliminate the need to rebuild interchanges or undertake very expensive acquisitions of rights of way. They eliminate the $250 million allocated to toll systems on I-5, and then there's the question of whether one would need to impose a similar scheme over on I-205. They would directly connect the ports of Vancouver and Portland, and they would reduce both traffic and business disruption costs, keep and add jobs. Now, there are good time reasons for these solutions to be implemented. They all can be phased and therefore can be done more quickly. They can be implemented at different times. Financing can come from different sources, from highway and rail and marine and port funds. There are fewer construction delays, which will take less time, minimal economic and environmental disruptions. Certainly, you can avoid the political delays of tolling and preserve the free flow of commerce and labor and capital between the states. And then there are good choice reasons to do so because you're providing 2 or 3 crossings at far less than the cost of a single one. You disperse traffic, which is now concentrated by a single bridge. You serve both ports and industrial areas directly, removing the need or desire to go over to the I-5 freeway. You open 2 underutilized corridors, MLK and North Portland Road. You improve both freight and the potential of commuter rail with the 3rd rail over the road rail bridge. In fact, right now you can ride between Vancouver Station and Union Station in 15 minutes. You eliminate the marine navigation delays and dangers. You provide the very same 6 through lanes on I-5 as does the CRC, as well as 4 additional arterial lanes. There also are very good developmental reasons to do so. You can see that there are 2,300 acres there, and you can stimulate urban mixed-use development on them, which will increase the tax bases on both sides of the river. You can bring transit both to and through underdeveloped areas, stimulating development there. And you can balance development with a multimodal transportation system, which includes automobiles and trucks, barges and rail, and for rail, freight and intercity rail, as well as commuter rail and light rail if it's desired. So what you do is to create a networked transportation system as opposed to a single freeway. And so here are the actions we're requesting that you take to provide faster and better and cheaper solutions. Stop funding the CRC drain. That currently is at the burn rate of $1.9 million per month. Second, please stop the acquisition and takings of these 300 and more properties. And third, impartially study alternatives, all reasonable alternatives before your 2013 session, including the common sense alternative, a twin bridges alternative, a high-speed rail, and a 3rd bridge alternative. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mock. Questions for Mr. Mock?
I assume that, Mr. Chair, that this information is available. I don't see it on the dais.
You mean printed information?
Yes,
Yes, we have some. And Ron, you have the printed information?
if you would, please.
I'll give you.
See no questions. Thank you very much. Mr. Smith.
And he will be speaking at some length on risk and alternatives.
Good morning, co-chairs, members of the committee. For the record, Joe Courtwright. I'm an economist with Impresa here in Portland, Oregon, and I'm pleased to be here today to talk about the financial risks of the Columbia River crossing. Now, I know that most of you, being ordinary human beings, relish listening to an economist about as much as most of us enjoy a trip to the dentist. But when billions of dollars are at stake, it's imperative to get the numbers right. And for this project, the numbers are not right. And you should be very concerned and take the time to make sure that you are well-versed and that you have your questions answered. I'll be covering several major points here, starting with the traffic and toll forecasts, looking at the source of state and federal revenue, the potential impact of cost overruns, and then finally concluding with a risk analysis. Let me begin with the traffic and toll forecasts because they really underpin both the need for this project and a critical component of its financing. In order for this project to be justified and to be affordable, we have to have a very clear and precise understanding of what the future looks like and how many vehicles and how many trips are going to be going across the Columbia River. And unfortunately, we do not know that. The project's forecast looks very much like this. These are numbers taken from the environmental impact statement, the final environmental impact statement. And they show a steady and predictable and, in fact, very rapid growth in traffic across the river from about 127,000 vehicles today to about 184,000 vehicles in the year 2030. That's the worldview of this project. But unfortunately, we know that future will never come to pass, because we've seen in the last few years a complete reversal in traffic patterns across the Columbia River. This shows the actual data in the 5 years since the base year of the Columbia River crossings forecast. And if you look closely at these numbers, in the 5 to 6 years since they issued the numbers, they've missed the forecast by 17,000 vehicles per day. We're not increasing the number of people going across the river, it's actually decreasing. That should tell you right now that the models are not correct. And this is not an anomaly. It doesn't apply just to the Columbia River crossing. We're seeing a terrific decline, a reversal of the increase in automobile traffic, not just here, but across the United States. Average vehicle traffic per person in the United States has seen a historical decline in the last 5 years. Driving, according to ODOT's own numbers, is down sharply in Oregon. We're now driving at about the same levels we were in the late 1980s on a per-person basis. So that underlying belief that there'll be this rapid increase in the number of people going across I-5 is simply not justified. And the reason is that the models that they're using to predict the future are simply wrong. They're outdated. The underlying behavioral data, the surveys that were done of the way people choose destinations and how far they travel, are drawn from nearly 20-year-old surveys of how people acted in the 1990s when gasoline cost $1 a gallon. The model run that is in the final environmental impact statement has a base year of 2005, well before the current increase in gasoline prices. And the updated final environmental impact statement, the one that cost on the order of $100 million to put together, has no traffic data after 2005. For the Columbia River crossing, the world stopped in 2005. Now, we'd all like to go back and live in a world where gasoline cost $1.50 a gallon. But that's not a logical basis on which to predicate future transportation planning, and it's certainly not a logical basis on which to invest billions of dollars. But that's essentially what you're being asked to do. These models simply don't account for the big increase in gas prices. As I said, all the models were built on base data on how people behaved and what driving looked like when gasoline cost $1 or $1.50 a gallon. And they've assumed that the price of gasoline increases no faster than inflation. And I want to alert you to something that is frequently said by CRC opponents, they say, or proponents, which is they say, oh, our model does allow for an increase in the price of gasoline. It does, but they assume that gas prices increase no faster than any other prices. And if that were true, on the base period that they're talking here, gasoline today would cost $1.50 or $1.75 a gallon. So the models that they've got are predicated on a far lower price of gasoline. And as we all know, the price of gasoline is dramatically different than it looked in 2005. I put the red line in there for 2005. That's what the world looked like then. We were used to a very low and only moderately increasing price of gasoline. Now, as we all know, at the pump, we're paying close to or perhaps more than $4 a gallon. And that's one critical problem, but there are deeper-seated problems in the modeling as well. We know that this bridge is going to be a tolled bridge, and forecasting traffic on a tolled bridge is a very different proposition than forecasting traffic on ordinary roads that are not tolled. We're in the fortunate position where the Oregon Department of Transportation commissioned 3 consultants who have all worked on the CRC to do a critical evaluation of whether its models were adequate to forecast traffic on tolled facilities. And this is the report prepared for the Oregon Department of Transportation. And this is its conclusion. Existing models, including the Metro model that serves as the basis for this project, are not able to determine how travelers would change their mode, route, travel time, or destination in response to tolling or pricing. The fundamental kind of model that they used just simply doesn't work for a tolled facility. So you have no confidence, or should have no confidence, in these numbers. Now, in addition, last year, the state treasurer brought in the world's foremost expert on toll revenue forecasting, a gentleman named Robert Bain from London, who worked for Standard & Poor's and reviewed most of the toll revenue forecasts in the world, the foremost expert in the world. He literally wrote the book on the subject, which I have right here. And you have in the two handouts that I gave you a copy of Mr. Bain's report to the state treasurer. And this is what he said about CRC traffic analysis. He says they're not suitable for the financing of this bridge, that the traffic projections are confusing and outdated, and that it was a serious professional flaw to leave out the last 5 years' worth of historical data and to not test to see whether your model actually predicted what happened in the real world. He said their diversion estimates to 205, how many people would go to another route, were worrying, and that overall it appears to have overestimated traffic by about 25% at a first cut view, but it could be more serious than that. That is a serious warning sign to thinking about this. So it's not just the gas prices, the model is flawed, independent experts tell you it's wrong, and most importantly, what hasn't happened and what you as legislators should insist on happening as soon as possible is the preparation of what is called an investment grade forecast. What, may you ask, is an investment grade forecast? It's what the people on Wall Street will insist that you prepare before they will give you any money against future toll revenues. And they do a number of things to essentially stress test the kind of promotional forecast that's been put together before. That is, the people on Wall Street will not take the forecast that has been done now because they know it's overinflated. They will want more realistic numbers. That hasn't been done. Fortunately, we know what an investment grade forecast looks like in the Pacific Northwest because the state of Washington is just a little bit ahead of us. They did an investment grade forecast for the SR 520 floating bridge in Seattle. It's done. It's not a hard thing to do. We're talking probably about $200,000 there. They did this forecast, and when they did it for the SR 520, this was the result that they got. That the traffic across SR 520, which is in the same ballpark, roughly speaking, as I-5, goes from 100,000 vehicles a day to about 60,000 vehicles per day, and that it doesn't recover its previous level of traffic after you toll the bridge for 20 years. Now, I want to suggest to you that there's nothing in that very aggressive growth forecast, the first slide I showed you, that is in any way compatible with this kind of a projection. That is, the CRC has not looked at the financial consequences of a significant and prolonged reduction in traffic across I-5 when you implement tolls. So, and I'll also hasten to add, this was one of the recommendations of the independent review panel. The governors reported, they said you need an investment grade forecast. There is literally no reason why you should wait for that to be produced. And even though you might have to redo it or update it, you should have at least as much information in your hands as the folks in Wall Street would have. In the wake of the 520 floating bridge, and they implemented tolling in December of this year, and traffic has gone down about 35%, as predicted on that bridge, Washington has taken a look at another project that they plan to toll, which is the deep bore tunnel that they'll be building under Seattle to replace the Alaska Way Viaduct. And for the last 5 years, WashDOT officials have been confidently telling the Washington legislature and the public that they can get $400 million out of tolling that viaduct, or the replacement tunnel. 3 weeks ago, they changed their minds, and they cut the estimate of toll revenues in half, based on the experience that they saw from the 520 bridge. And unfortunately, that second thought by WashDOT came after they signed the construction contract with the boring contractor. That is a situation that I hope you as Oregon legislators don't find yourselves in, where only after the contracts are signed do you get a realistic estimate of what toll revenues might provide. Now, at your hearing in January, you were told, oh, what we saw in 520 is similar to what we have predicted for the Columbia River crossing. It's similar in the sense that they've pulled down the revenue numbers somewhat, but the magnitudes are very, very different. This chart shows you pages from the draft environmental impact statement issued 5 years ago and the final environmental impact statement, which came out last September. And you can see that they have lowered the amount of money that they expect to get from tolls, but not very much, by about 13 to 18%. They haven't done anything like the kind of rigorous analysis that would tell you with any confidence how much the reduction could be, and they haven't reflected the experience of 520, which is this very significant and sustained drop. And the other thing is, it's very likely that the decline on 520 will be much less than the decline over the Columbia River, because the people who are driving across Lake Washington, a lot of them who work at places like Microsoft, earn a lot more money and can afford to pay tolls. There are a lot more high-income commuters, about 50,000 high-income commuters moving back and forth across Lake Washington on I-90 and SR 520, and only about 60% as many moving across the Columbia River. About 70% of the people who drive in the Seattle area are high-income commuters, and only about half across the river. And income correlates very strong with toll diversion. It's very likely we would see even larger diversion than they've seen in the Seattle area. And again, they haven't analyzed that. Now, we've been told a number of things in response to the criticisms that I've offered here. And I'll go through each of these claims that have been made about how we should actually rely on these numbers. We were told that they were peer-reviewed. Yes, they were, by a group of peers that were selected by CRC. That were given a binder and 2 days. They weren't provided with any actual traffic data post-2005, the numbers that you've just seen today. They were not provided with the critiques of the CRC traffic numbers that were entered into the draft environmental impact statement comment process. They were not asked to validate the results, only to say, did you follow a professional practice? And as I've noted with the Bain study, other independent reviewers have said that there are deep flaws. So the real peer review suggests that these are wrong. They've also claimed that, well, it's really just the recession. But in fact, the decline in traffic over the I-5 bridges clearly predates the recession. Again, this is the Bain Consulting report to the Treasury, who says it's a 15 to 20-year trend. And more importantly, whether it's the recession or not, traffic is not growing. It continues to decline even after the recession, again, because of high gas prices. Now, we're told that the Metro model is a state-of-the-art model. Well, yeah, it probably is. The trouble is the state-of-the-art has some flaws in it. And the Government Accountability Office, which looked at traffic modeling in the United States at the time this project models were being put together, said the kind of models that we do right now tend to systematically overestimate future congestion levels. It's just a fundamental flaw in the art, and that was confirmed by the National Academy of Sciences in 2007. And then finally, despite the merits of the Metro model, they literally didn't take the output of the Metro model. They took the output of the Metro model, and then they changed some of the numbers. They did something that's euphemistically called post-processing, and moved about 6% of the traffic the model said would go over the I-205 bridge and moved over the I-5 bridge. So despite the merits of the model, they substituted their judgment for it at the end. So they don't even have that much faith in it. Second point I'd like to talk about is federal highway funding risks. The federal government is expected to provide $400 to $500 million in discretionary funding, in earmarks for this project. That seems very unlikely because the Federal Highway Trust Fund is running out of money. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that it will be $100 billion in deficit by the end of this decade, and is likely to be in negative territory within the next 18 months. Obviously, federal funding is the subject of reauthorization right now, and Congress has essentially scratched earmarks out of the transportation reauthorization. There aren't any earmarks in the bill. It's one of the reasons why it's difficult to pass the legislation. And they've shifted to almost entirely formula funding. And it's clear, based on ODOT's own analysis of both the House and the Senate bills, that we will get less federal money in future years than we get in the past. So it's not that we'll get more, and it's not that there'll be discretionary money, but there'll be between $8 and $45 million less a year coming to Oregon. Now, advocates for the CRC have argued for some time that there's this special pot of money out there that only the CRC could qualify for. And that's what Director Garrett told you a little over a year ago in a letter to the legislature. But in fact, the special pots of money, the earmarks, the discretionary money, have been written out of the legislation. The projects of national significance legislation has been essentially repealed in the House version of the bill and defunded in the Senate version of the bill, moved out of the Highway Trust Fund, subject to annual appropriations. The best guess from the Congressional Budget Office is there might be $100 million total each year available in this project of national regional significance. CRC would have to get all of that, essentially, to meet its target. And this bill eliminates what's called interstate maintenance discretionary, the other pot of discretionary money. As a result, CRC officials are now saying, we don't know where that money will come from. That's what Director Garrett said in this room in August. It's what Patricia McCaig said to you in January. And the other thing to know about discretionary funding is it is discretionary. There are a lot of different projects that can qualify for discretionary funding. CRC isn't the only one. We routinely get discretionary funding for a lot of different projects around the state of Oregon. These are the records for what's called the Interstate and Maintenance Discretionary Program over the last decade. And you can see projects around the state in Salem, Tualatin, Ontario, Medford have all gotten funding. CRC's gotten funding too. But this is a set of money that's essentially fungible, that if we have a good project anywhere in the state, we can go after it. It's not a special pot for CRC. So as a result, CRC has made it clear in the environmental impact statement that they will seek federal formula funding in the future to pay for the Columbia River crossing. That's money that comes to Oregon based on our population, our road network, and the like. So what they're talking about really is diverting future federal money that we will get regardless of what we do and spending it on the CRC. So it really does compete with projects around the state. And finally, CRC has made the point in the last few months that they could go to a federal program called TIFIA to help them finance this project. And they could, but TIFIA is a competitive program with limited money. It's a loan. You have to pay it back, so it doesn't add to the funding for this project. And the federal government is likely to treat any money that it gives you through TIFIA as a substitute for the grant money that you're otherwise seeking. And the other thing is with TIFIA, you have to do an investment grade forecast. That hasn't been done, so we don't even know if we're eligible for that money. Next big component of the project is transit funding. And they're counting on getting about $850 million from the federal government for the transit portion of the project. And that's a very large number. In fact, but it's not guaranteed at all. If you read the fine print in the environmental impact statement, it says the assumed amount is not guaranteed and will have to be negotiated. Now, this is an unprecedentedly large share of the project that would have to be paid for by the federal government. It amounts to 90% of the cost of the transit portion of the project. So of the $944 million that the light rail component will cost, they think the federal government will pay for $850 million. The standard is about 50%. So what is it about this project that makes them think that we'll get 90% federal share? It's a good question. And the reason is they got a provision inserted by Senator Patty Murray in an authorization bill 2 years ago. And I won't bore you with the language here, but the short description would be they made a provision that only CRC can qualify for that would technically allow the Federal Transit Administration to treat the highway portion of the project as matched for the transit portion of the project. And they're assuming that under that particular circumstance, they'll get 90% funding. I'd hasten to add this is completely untested. Nobody's ever done this before. We don't know if they'll do it. And a problem is that the New Starts program is running out of money. It too is funded out of that same pot, the Federal Highway Fund. And there's some concerns that we'll even get the full funding that we are expected to get for the already underway Portland-Milwaukee Light Rail. So as a result, the federal share could be much lower than 90%. In fact, just 2 years ago, TriMet was counting on getting 60%, which they could legally have gotten from FTA, and which we've gotten in previous years. But when the final papers were signed, FTA only came up with 50%. And that blew a $100 million hole in that project that had to be met by cutting the project back, borrowing additional money, and sacrificing money that could have gone to other projects. So there's no guarantee we'll get this aggressive 90% share. Fourth point is our partners in the state of Washington, and we're counting on them to ante up $450 million for the Columbia River crossing. As yet, Washington has appropriated nothing for construction of the CRC. This is taken from a legislative document, and one of the things Washington does is spell out how they're going to allocate money for the next 5 years. And if you see, it's a little bit fine print there, but essentially after this biennium, they have zeros for each of the next 5 bienniums for the Columbia River crossing. They haven't identified any money for that. But they have identified money for lots of other projects in Washington. In fact, they have 2 very large projects in Washington. They're rebuilding the floating bridge across Lake Washington at a cost of almost $5 billion. They're building a very expensive tunnel under downtown Seattle. And neither of those projects are fully funded yet. They've allocated money for the next 5 years, or actually 6 years, for each of them, but they will have to come up with even more money. And these projects are both contracted, they're underway. So where do you think the CRC stands in the priority structure of the state of Washington? very clear that they have some very big lifts that they have to take care of before they can come up with money for CRC. And this is a state that has gone deeply into debt with its gas tax monies. It's bonded virtually all of its gas tax monies. In the next 3 or 4 years, it will be at a point where it's spending 70% of its net receipts from gas tax on retiring debt service for projects that it's already built, or are building right now. Again, which leaves very little capacity to fund new projects. And there's nothing in the pipeline. Governor Gregoire, who leaves office at the end of this year, who's stated her support for CRC, put nothing for CRC construction in her final budget. And the Washington legislature, the chairs of the Senate and House Transportation Committees said, we think we might have a transportation package to take to the voters in 2014. So it'll be 2014 at least before Washington has any idea whether it really has the resources to pull its weight on this project. Our situation in Oregon is not as dire as Washington, but we face real limitations too. We're expected to come up with half of the $900 million that the two states are asking for. But the total cost will be much greater than that. Because we don't have the $450 million cash on hand, we'll have to borrow it. And effectively what that means is that we'll have to spend about another $450 million in interest over the 30-year life of those bonds in order to pay them back. In addition, the state won't just ante up its money. You'll have to guarantee the toll bonds that are issued by the tolls, paying them back if the tolls don't come in at the expected levels. You'll have to cover cost overruns. You'll have to cover shortfalls from the federal government. And you'll have to cash flow this project, which needs all of its money up front. And that will require additional borrowing. So it's not just the $450 million. As we know from ODOT's own reports to the legislature that they are running out of cash. Late last year, Director Garrett told you that they expected to cut their capital spending in half, essentially because they borrowed against future gas tax revenues, and they'll have to be devoting an increasing share of their revenue to debt service. And their revenues are not growing as rapidly as they expected. Debt service is going to be $210 million a year next year, and will continue at that level or higher. And as you all know, gas tax receipts have leveled off and are declining. So our revenue situation is not good. Let me now talk about the potential for cost overruns. The CRC is what we call a mega project. It is a multi-billion-dollar project, obviously a very complicated project. There have been lots of studies of these multi-billion-dollar transportation projects, and two things are true of them. 90% of them go over budget. And the average project goes over budget by 28%. Bridges go over budget even more. It's a consistent pattern across the world. And it's a consistent pattern in Oregon. Every one of ODOT's major projects is more than 100% over the budget that was presented at the time the project was approved at about the same stage it was as the CRC is today. The Pioneer Mountain Eddyville project is more than twice what it was supposed to cost. The Grand Avenue Viaduct here in Portland, almost triple what it was supposed to cost. The Newburgh-Dundee bypass price tag has escalated by a factor of more than 2. These numbers are all taken from ODOT documents. And this isn't meant to be a criticism of the Department of Transportation. It just tells you when you do these big projects, they inevitably tend to be more expensive than you hoped they would be at the beginning. And you are financially responsible for that, so you will need to plan for it. Washington isn't a lot better. They have cost overruns on their big projects too. And this project risk is compounded by the fact that we're shifting to something called design-build. And in theory, design-build should shift all the responsibility for cost overruns to the contractor. But in practice, we know it doesn't work out that way. And we have the experience of Pioneer Mountain Eddyville. That project has come to a complete standstill twice. It's been delayed more than 2 years. The state has had to put more money into the project, and it's cost twice as much. And I'm informed this morning that the Department of Transportation issued a default notice on the contractor. Now, how much longer it will take to resolve this and how much more it will cost, nobody knows. But in this project, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar risk. You have been told that there's something called the cost estimate validation process that will somehow insulate us from the risk of cost overruns. And you were told, or the House Transportation Committee was told just about a year ago that the CEVP was reviewed by the independent review panel, that independent panel appointed by Governors Kolongoski and Gregoire, and that they had accepted the analysis of the CEVP. But the CEVP, that's not what the IRP said. The IRP expressed serious concerns about the quality and adequacy of the CEVP. They said there was significant risk that the numbers weren't accurate enough, that the reliability of the outputs were suspect, and the credibility of the cost basis was problematic. Those are not words that are expressing a ringing endorsement of CEVP. And I provided you, I think, with a copy of the excerpts of pages of the CEV report, so you can see that those quotes are very much in context. In addition, the CEVP, while it's a good idea, hasn't worked. The CEVP did not detect the fact that the open web design that they pursued for 2 years was in fact unbuildable. It did not detect the fact that there was a problem with the 95-foot clearance and that the bridge may have to be raised at a cost of $100 million or more. You will not find reference to either of those things in the cost estimate validation project. It's always the things that you didn't identify that drive up the cost. And I would also note Washington has never completed a multi-billion-dollar project with CEVP. So you'll be told it's a good thing, but it's a challenge. Let me conclude by tying this all together and trying to put this in the framework of how I think you should address this question as legislators and consider what your risk is as you enter into this deal. Because once you embark on this process, you will have very little control over what happens. You will essentially be in a situation where you'll have to pay the bills. So you should go in with your eyes open as to what the risks are. As I look at this financial plan, the base financial plan that's reflected in the environmental impact statement, it's all about optimism. All of the forecasts for the amount of money that they expect to get from tolls, from the federal government, from their partner in Washington, are all at the high end of the range. And the independent review panel, convened by the governors, said a year and a half ago that failure to get any one of the pieces of the money or getting less of that money can make the entire project unmanageable or unaffordable. That was a clear warning. And what did they suggest? They suggested that you need to break the project down into phases. And they said, despite your best efforts to get the money, you probably won't get all of it. You should break it, in their words, into thirds. And they also specifically warned that you shouldn't just do token cost cutting. And I'd note that the phasing that's reflected in the environmental impact statement is, in fact, token cost cutting. It's only a 5% reduction in the total cost. And in fact, there is no financial contingency plan. They have never said, who's going to pay for this if all of these sources of money do not come in at the expected amounts? That's a big concern. And I'll tell you who the answer is. You will pay for it. The state of Oregon and the state of Washington will pay for it. Cost overruns do not go to the federal government. So let me summarize the risks to the state of Oregon and try and quantify what I think they are. If there is an average level of cost overrun, that adds $1 billion to this project, 28% on $3.5 billion. Our liability for that would be $500 million. If the FTA money comes in at the same level as the Portland-Milwaukee Light Rail at 50% of project costs, that costs you $200 million. If there are no earmarks, and there aren't any right now, then that's another $200 million you have to come up with. If the toll forecasts look anything like what's going on in 520 right now, that will probably cost you $200 million. That's a potential risk of $1 billion that you better be prepared to pay. But more than that, because you do not have $1 billion lying around, you will have to borrow that money. And at 5.5% interest over 30 years, you can add $1 in interest for every dollar that you have to borrow, and that doubles the price of it. So to bare minimum, if they're right about the $450 million that you put in, that costs the state close to $900 million over the next 30 years. But then when you have to finance the interest costs of the cost overruns and revenue shortfalls, the total bill with interest could end up to $3 billion over the next 30 years. So you should be prepared to think about what the risk is to the state of Oregon in terms of a $30 billion cost. And I'll conclude there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, your next witness.
Our next witness is Chris Giard, who is the CEO of Plaid Pantry, Inc., a close observer of and supporter for a vibrant Oregon economy.
Good morning, co-chairs, members. Chris Giard, CEO of Plaid Pantry. Most people now understand that the finance plan for this project has huge and unacceptable risks, and we can't commit to the full project without a phasing plan. The governor's independent review panel gave us detailed recommendations on this, but the CRC has not provided a workable phasing plan. They have simply drawn an intermediate pausing point off the full original plan, and what you see in their draft plan is in the exhibits that I provided, and I'll be referring to that. Just this one that shows the Oregon side with all the purple on it. The purple and the yellow road and the green rail line is the $2.5 billion piece. And it's putting the new bridges in and rebuilding SR 14 in Washington. The arterial harbor bridge and the light rail line, and the whole thing is just kind of stubbed into Hayden Island. In fact, in the inset there, you'll see that the arterial is just kind of pushed over to the side until they start bringing the light rail in. And what the proposal is that we're going to spend 70% of the total planned original dollars with almost none of the benefits. These components are essentially minimally functional without the original planned Hayden Island roadways, the Marine Drive connections, and the light rail feeder roads. The plan would have Hayden Island essentially remain in its current configuration, again referring to the inset, under construction for 4 years, presumably as a staging area for the bridge construction. Then if we get funding beyond the $2.5 million, Hayden Island will then continue under construction for another 4 years to complete the originally planned infrastructure, the orange stuff, that makes it work with Marine Drive. The IRP, the key concept of phasing is, as Joe pointed out, the smaller, independently functional pieces that address the most pressing problems first. The idea is that if you run out of money, which is probable with this project, you have something worthwhile that solves a problem. This plan is simply confirmation of what the engineers have been saying to you all along, and that is, this is a fully integrated project that needs all of its parts if it's going to work. We're in for the full project. Make no mistake about that. We're going to keep spending until it's done. We're going to find the money wherever we can over whatever period of time it takes. That's what this is telling you. It was said by, by a project leader at your last hearing that the risk here is that we don't get started. The greater risk is that we do get started with a plan that we can't pay for and end up inevitably going to taxpayers in a very big way. It's obvious that we can't stop after this $2.5 billion investment and say, well, I wish I could have done that next phase, but look, we got some really good bang for our bucks in what we did, and we solved a significant problem. That's what a phasing plan should allow you to say. What you see here is not a phasing plan. Joe described the risks and uncertainties. The 100% of the funds projected from 100% of the sources, and you see the challenges with them. This is completely unrealistic. But there's no discussion of alternatives or contingencies for when we come up short. How much of the federal highway money do we really think we're going to get, and when do we think we're going to get it? When do we think Washington's going to fund their portion? How about the FTA? I'd like to make one final point, kind of tagging on to what Joe said, and I'm not an economist, so I look at things a little bit differently. I hope it's clear to you on this funding, toll funding piece, that to generate $1.5 billion in construction funding, the plan is that we need to collect $6 billion from bridge users on the tolls. $6 billion to get $1.5 billion over a 30-year period. And the reason is that it costs $1.7 billion just to collect the tolls. And then on top of that, there's $3 billion in interest. This is very costly financing, but the most important point that I want to make today is when we miss on the traffic, and we're missing 12% now, from where we thought it would be to where it is, 12% now, we don't come up short the construction funding amount. We miss on that big number. We miss on that $6 billion number. So if traffic is 10% below projections, we don't have a $150 million hole to fill. We've got $600 million that we have to find. It's this extreme leverage from a businessman's point of view that relies on obviously incorrect traffic numbers that, in my opinion, is the most dangerous part of this finance plan. This project has not had anywhere near the due diligence required. We need to take these numbers apart, review key assumptions, challenge the basis for each assumption, look at greater detail, test what-if scenarios, and demand contingency plans. I request that you do this for us. Apply due diligence, common sense, good financial judgment, which has been missing from this project. My other recommendation in closing is to get that independent professional traffic study. It's the key for the financing for a toll-based program, but it'll tell you something else. It'll tell you what the traffic's going to be in various ranges of tolling, and that gets to the whole purpose and need of this thing. We don't know what it's going to be, but the traffic's going to be lower, and the ridiculous outcome could be that we build something this big, and the traffic is down, as Joe pointed out it could be, and not only can we not pay for the bonds, but we don't have the traffic that we built the bridge for. So I realize there's a lot of political pressure to move forward with the original plan, but if we get this wrong, literally generations of future taxpayers are going to be saddled with our mistake. I really appreciate you providing this time for us to talk, and thank you for letting me testify.
Thank you, Mr. Gerard.
Mr. Chair, with your permission, to our testifiers, each of our testifiers so far, except for Joe Courtwright, has run over the time that they were promised they would have, and if we continue to do that, our last 2 or 3 presenters are going to have nothing to say. So please, each of you, be disciplined and keep your eye, and when I give you the sign, that's a serious sign.
1 minute, Joe.
Mr. Chair, our next witness is Bob Stacy, who served as Planning Director for the City of Portland, Policy Director for TriMet, and Executive Director of 1,000 Friends of Oregon. He is currently a candidate for Metro Council.
Thank you, Joe. I'll take your instructions seriously. And co-chairs, members of the committee, Bob Stacy, thanks for the opportunity to appear today. I'm not here to advocate for a particular alternative design. I'm here to point out ways to simplify the project and reduce its cost. And I have to tell you that sitting on this panel following Chris and Joe humbles me and reminds me how urgently important it is that your committee, the department, the governor, take very seriously every opportunity to reduce cost in this project and reduce the state's exposure. I'm hoping that we can identify those things that can simplify the project, reduce cost, while ensuring that the fundamental purposes of the Columbia Crossing project are realized as soon as possible. My testimony have a very short list of what I think are those fundamental purposes. Moving freight more reliably and efficiently over the river and along I-5. Increasing the overall people-moving capacity of the corridor by offering additional transportation choices. And improving safety in the project area. It's a really short list, and those are achievable outcomes by fixing the traffic snarls caused by having 3 interchanges too close together, by charging higher peak hour tolls to reduce congestion from single occupant cars, so freight and important commuter traffic can move through, and by adding transit and safe walking and biking paths, we can move more people and more freight more safely over the river. But unfortunately, we're not going to get there affordably or quickly with the current design. The project sponsors have a much longer to-do list than the 3 items I've mentioned. More freight, more passengers, more safety. Those additional items don't help meet those goals. In fact, I think in some cases they tend to get in the way, but they do add, as you've heard, billions of dollars in construction cost and huge environmental and community costs as well. I'd suggest there are at least 3 pieces of the CRC that are unnecessary and costly, and they're therefore endangering and delaying CRC's success. First, the decision to keep a freeway interchange on Hayden Island. Bear with me. We know that the worst traffic problem in the corridor is that you've got 3 interchanges within a mile of each other, roughly speaking. Downtown Vancouver SR 14, Hayden Island, and Marine Drive. Much of the massive cost of this project is caused by keeping the Hayden Island interchange and trying to avoid the traffic snarls with a $575 million tangle of ramps and weave lanes, which the Oregonian says makes the freeway on Hayden Island approximately 17 lanes wide. Now, local traffic to and from Hayden Island doesn't need 17 lanes or a massive interchange. It needs some kind of local bridge access. In fact, the CRC project proposal includes a local transit and traffic bridge that connects Hayden Island to Marine Drive, which would make it unnecessary for residents to get on and off I-5 in order to reach the rest of Portland. Eliminating the Hayden Island interchange and providing local access to and from the island can save $575 million in project cost and would give residents of the island a big chunk of that island back. Second problem, opportunity for cost savings, is the decision to tear down and replace the existing bridges. If you're trying to get 6 lanes of through traffic over the Columbia River, plus local traffic and bicycles and transit and pedestrians, why would you start by tearing down 2 existing bridges that have 6 lanes and 2 sidewalks? According to ODOT, these bridges have at least 50 years useful life remaining in them. They can be seismically upgraded, as others have spoken to, and unlike their proposed replacements, they actually allow tall ships to get under. Tearing them down while maintaining, how much, Joe?
Minute.
Tearing down while maintaining navigation and protecting salmon will cost at least $100 million to tear them down. We should be supplementing these bridges with an additional bridge, not throwing away the investment that we already have that we're using and can still work for us, and spend hundreds of millions to replace that capacity. Third problem, building increased capacity for moving more cars at peak. South of the bridge, as you've heard, I-5 is 6 lanes wide, but the CRC staff wants a 10-lane freeway restripable to 12 on the bridge. Disregard for the moment that, as Joe said very eloquently, traffic is going down. If people drive across that bridge, that will flood North and Northeast Portland arterials with cut-through traffic, and it will clog up the freeway throughout the region. We can use peak hour congestion to reduce the bottleneck instead of widening the freeway on the bridge, which will not reduce the problem. Finally, Everett Dirksen these days is more famous for one thing he said than his entire career, and that was, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon you've got real money. I think it's clear the CRC cost is real money. Something urgently needs to be done to reduce that cost. Otherwise, we will pay it through other projects that are canceled, higher taxes, or both. Please send the Department of Transportation a message. Eliminate a costly interchange, keep a couple of bridges we already have, build something smaller and more cost-effective to supplement them, and save $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions for this panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 2 questions for Mr. Courtwright. I understand your attention to detail. You're always very thorough, so please bear with me while I try to be thorough in making sure that I'm analyzing the information you present to us. The first part of your presentation was focused on traffic, volume, and sensitivity to price of gas. So let's do a what if. What if there's a breakthrough in battery technology, a breakthrough in manufacturing of electric vehicles and smaller vehicles, and the cost of hybrids and EVs goes down significantly? Will we have people then driving at a rate per capita similar to what it was in the past, because the price per gallon of gas is no longer the primary factor influencing their driving choices?
Co-Chair Bentz, Representative Nathanson. Yeah, absolutely. If you had a free source of energy or a very low-cost source of energy that lowered the cost, then you would expect travel to increase somewhat. The evidence so far is that the replacement technologies that we're talking about are not cheaper when you consider both the capital and the operating costs. So, but if there were some huge breakthrough, then absolutely. And similarly, if we went back to $1 a gallon gasoline, I would expect that to increase. The question is, what do you want to plan on, and how do you want to scale the infrastructure? And I think, as Mr. Stacy pointed out, the likelihood is you'll build, 10, 12 lanes of capacity and never use it.
The other question I have is, you've done a very thorough job laying out concerns about the financing plan for the CRC project that we see in front of us, but it causes enough concern that I wonder what your opinion would be. Can we afford anything at all? Could we afford alternatives? There are some alternative suggestions that have been presented already today. There may be more that we're going to hear about. Should we consider the picture is so bleak that the federal government won't come up with anything, that the cost overruns will be too big, and that the state of Oregon really shouldn't be involved in anything of this magnitude?
Representative Nathanson, I think the concerns go to the way that this project is structured, and that it's one, as Chris said, it's an integrated entity. You build the whole thing, and you essentially bite off the financing of the whole thing. I think what the risks argue for is going with an incremental strategy where you break it down into smaller pieces and get results, and then see whether you can afford the investment. But we're basically in a situation where they've designed a facility for a world where 180,000 people, mostly in cars, are going across that river every day. And you may want to build something that is more of an incremental solution that you can afford, rather than spend all that money on something that you may never need.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question that will probably apply to both Mr. Gard and Mr. Courtright. And as you were going through your presentation, Mr. Courtright, I had a lot of questions that you kept answering before I needed to ask. So thank you. That was very convenient. But one question I had was on the investment grade analysis. You suggested it's about $200,000 to do that, which is just almost a tenth of what we spend monthly on this project right now. And that $200,000 would give us a lot of information on a financial viability of a third of the funding of this project. But isn't
insult to the many historical injustices visited on the residents of our community. The cost, the CRC Highway Mega Project would be the most expensive public works project ever in our region, even if it could be built on budget, which highway mega projects never are. We just watched you make very hard choices to balance our state budget. This is certainly not the time to go forward with this bloated and wasteful project, a project that is costing us $1 million a month, a project that CRC staff admit will not solve I-5 congestion. With declining gas tax revenues, we are unable to maintain our existing transportation infrastructure. With a multi-billion-dollar backlog of highway and street repairs statewide, we cannot put all our resources into expanding one 5-mile stretch of freeway. If we dedicate billions to this project, it will mean even less money available for maintenance and would likely preclude any major transportation project in the state for a generation. My neighbors are not willing to pay higher gas taxes and higher vehicle registration fees for a highway mega project that primarily benefits Washington commuters at our expense, that will make our neighborhoods more congested and less safe, that threatens our health with reduced air quality, that ensures the continued deterioration of our transportation infrastructure. There are better ways to reduce congestion, there are better ways to move freight, and there are certainly better ways to create jobs for Oregonians. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for this panel? Oops, do we have I'm sorry, one more panel member. Sorry, go ahead.
Excuse me, I'm trying to get my PowerPoint up here.
While he's doing that, this is Floyd Smith, whose career has ranged from television reporter to crisis counseling to nonprofit management, and serves on the board of Oregon Rail and Transit Advocates, and he's promised me 4 minutes.
Well, I'm not getting it. I got it. Thanks. Is it? No.
You know, the world once ran without this stuff. Hard to believe.
Co-chairs, members of the committee, my name is Floyd Smith for the record. No wonder there's confusion about CRC jobs. First, you heard how much we need the freeway bridges to create jobs. Then it became clear that presumed jobs growth would not be near what was promised in CRC documents. The good news is the alternatives to the CRC would likely create as many or more long-term family wage jobs for the Portland-Vancouver region than the CRC. Notably, the final environmental impact statement does not present the overall jobs numbers in a clear and convincing way. One thing, however, is quite clear. The CRC, as envisioned by the freeway builders, would severely disrupt local businesses. The FEIS reports 916 jobs will be lost from 69 local businesses with an estimated annual sales loss of $104 million. And I remind you, all this data I discuss here today was reported long before the project phasing plan proposed in late January or the controversy over bridge height revealed several days ago. The greatest impact is on Hayden Island, where 39 businesses and 643 jobs would be eliminated by bridge approaches, ramps, and interchanges. In all, the elimination of 69 businesses and almost 1,000 employees does not account for the financial harm to nearby businesses, some likely to be ruined by construction disruption. In contrast to the reported job losses of about 1,000, the final environmental impact statement tells us that bridge design and construction will bring 20,000 jobs over the construction period of 10 to 11 years. The number is highly suspect, along with other CRC data, as you have heard, particularly from Joe Courtwright. A forensic certified public accountant has raised red flags about CRC financing. The media have called into question escalating costs of bridge planning, financing, and jobs data. Regarding CRC design and construction jobs, the director of the Oregon Economic Forum at the University of Oregon, Tim Dye, has stated, quote, "The way most of us are going to think about this is 2,000 jobs per year over the life of the project. The question is this like creating a new Intel? The answer is no. Intel, of course, is the state's largest employer and has fewer than 20,000 employees, the number of bridge jobs reported in the CRC final impact statement. This is, of course, as has been referenced earlier today, 10 times the number estimated by respected economists at about 2,000. The math is quite simple. The gain of 2,000 short-term design and construction jobs minus the loss of 1,000, about 1,000 long-term local business jobs taken out by the bridges. There is another important aspect to job creation here, regional economic development. CRC staff members tout the cost of congestion study, which was completed in 2005, as substantial evidence for building the freeway bridges, and I think this goes to an earlier question. The study claims the benefit from such investment supports 6,500 additional permanent jobs as of 2025. Unfortunately, the cost of congestion study fails to explain how this outcome was calculated. It gives no baseline data, or my study of the documents revealed no baseline data. I couldn't do the calculation. We know now, in the year 2012, that the CRC will not solve traffic congestion. The project director herself has gone on record stating the CRC would not solve all congestion problems. The traffic just stacks up at Delta Park and the Rose Quarter, which are choke points for Vancouver commuters driving to work in Portland. And the CRC would do little to alleviate truck traffic or fix barge navigation challenges on the river below. Members of the Smarter Bridge Committee, a coalition of disparate groups and individuals supporting alternatives to the proposed Columbia River crossing, want better economic development than the CRC can possibly provide. We believe jobs growth in the Portland-Vancouver area can be achieved by any number of plans that could supplant the CRC, alternatives that provide for phased bridge construction and create long-term family wage jobs sooner than would the CRC, jobs in rail, construction, and manufacturing. The alternatives, we believe, will create as many or more jobs than the CRC and displace few jobs. Thank you.
That was fast. Senator Morse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my question is to Tom Bushell. Bushell. You've made a case that the federal law has not been followed.
Repeatedly.
Excuse me?
Repeatedly, in my opinion.
And my question is twofold. If the CRC advances as it is currently designed, what's the probability of filing an action?
Well, the first question, the first part of that answer is that the ROD is final. So there's now a final agency action, and if anyone wanted to file litigation, they could do so tomorrow. I have clients, and I am subject to attorney-client privilege and have not been authorized to waive that privilege, so I am not going to disclose attorney-client communications. But I will tell you, looking at this record, do I think litigation will be filed? Yes.
Thank you. Follow-up. And if litigation is filed, would it successfully stop the project? And if so, likely how long?
I think that depends on how you would define stop. Ultimately, if the litigation were successful, a court would vacate the ROD, the record of decision, and then they would have to go back and redo whatever the court said was wrong. And that would probably take years. Would there be a preliminary injunction while the court's looking at the record? That's harder to say. The Supreme Court just tightened up the restrictions on getting preliminary injunctions. They're certainly not impossible. I've gotten several recently, but that might stop it more quickly if there were a preliminary injunction. But if litigation were successful, yeah, the ROD would be vacated.
Thank you.
Yes, Representative Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question also for you, Professor Michelle. Are you a professor there, or clinical?
You can call me Tom if you want to. That's what my students call me.
So I want to ask, I have two questions, and one's a follow-up to it. Can you clarify what the record of decision actually means? Does it mean that the federal government has, in fact, approved the project as being good, or does it mean it's approved the process of NEPA? What does the record of decision actually mean?
Certainly. The record of decision is issued by the Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Transit Department, and those two agencies looked at it, and they have said that it satisfies the legal requirements. That's always the case when I file a NEPA lawsuit. I have a federal agency saying they've satisfied the legal requirements. But yes, the Federal Highway Administration has said that they're satisfied with us.
And then a follow-up then. So at what point does a deviation from the project that's in the FEIS as presented in receiving that record of decision, if there's some alternatives, some changes, some tweaking to the plan in the FEIS, phasing or anything like that, at what point is a new FEIS required and the record of decision no longer applies?
That's really the $64,000 question here on a lot of this. There's a CEQ regulation that talks about that. That's the Council on Environmental Quality. They issued the regulations that actually define NEPA. NEPA itself is a pretty short statute that doesn't say much, but the regulations really sort of flesh it out. And what the regulations say is that if there's a change that has, I think the phrase is significant impacts that are different from the FEIS, or significant new information are the two different concepts to look at. Phasing is not discussed at length in the FEIS, certainly not the kind of phasing we saw the CRC talking about immediately after the ROD was approved, which would go on over years. And I think that's important because phasing is certainly going to have different environmental impacts than just building this bridge all at the same time. For, I think, pretty obvious reasons. So I would say that phasing is not evaluated in the FEIS, and if they decide to really truly phase it the way they're talking about, they need to do a supplemental document.
Thank you.
Co-Chair Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sweet, just I want to say I sympathize with the issues and concerns you raised for the neighborhood in there. It's been my observation that in rush hours, I've tried various ways to get around all over Portland, and there's no place you can get during rush hours. All the streets seem to be clogged. So I'm not sure any of this is going to answer that. But I guess I do have a question. If this project doesn't go forward, I don't see the situation getting any better. I just see it continue to get worse unless the assumption would be if it gets so bad, people won't live in Vancouver or won't work in Vancouver if they live in Oregon. I mean, it seems like that's how to do that. But if the assumption is that the project will move the traffic a little better, particularly the truck traffic, it seemed it would address to some degree the air pollution issues. And I do note that in the project, for good or bad, there is some transit options on there that would suggest that people would do that. And in fact, I guess if Mr. Courtwright is correct, it would significantly reduce the air pollution problems because you wouldn't have as much traffic. I don't know if you, that's just kind of beebling a little bit. But one that I specifically was interested in is, I've only heard one alternative bridge proposal here today. Would the neighborhood coalition, and I'm just asking the hypothesis, would you support that? That seems like it disperses the traffic even more into the neighborhood.
Mr. Co-Chair, Senator Beyer, yeah, we're certainly concerned that that a lot of the alternatives don't help us with our problem. I think what will help is giving people an alternative to single occupancy vehicles, and I think a rail solution, commuter rail, would take people out of their cars and would ease congestion on Interstate 5. Our concern is that if you increase the capacity of the freeway to the north of us, but don't increase the capacity of the freeway at the current pinch point, then congestion only gets worse, certainly doesn't get better. I suppose that if Mr. Courtwright is correct that imposing tolls in the current situation could reduce traffic, persuade people to move from Vancouver to Portland, and reduce commuter traffic, that might help. I think getting people out of their cars is what's going to make the difference.
Don't disagree with you. We haven't been successful with that yet.
We have, where we've given people alternatives.
No further questions. Thank you very much. And with that, we're going to take a 10-minute recess. Mr. Smith, who is up next?
Herman Kayshold is co-chair of the Hayden Island Livability Project, an island resident for over 4 years. He's retired but still working on and concerned about livability on the island, and he's going to give us 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
You have 5, and what you have is about 3, so he's giving us 2 minutes.
Do I need to put, no, I'm on, I can hear myself. Thank you very much for this opportunity to testify today. I really appreciate it. Name is Herman Kayshold, live on the island in Unit 42B, right on the river, love it. Been there since September of '07. Got a one-page simple document I submitted to you. We're a community of over 400 families, primarily low-income residents, many of us elderly and limited mobility. And like he said, I'm the co-chair of Hayden Island Livability Project, which is a group of residents and stakeholders on the island concerned with protecting their community and quality of life. We started out a couple years ago with the Save Our Safeway campaign, and we were formed pretty much after the CRC disbanded the Environmental Justice Working Group. And they seem to want to ignore that there's a problem in the environmental justice in our community. Anyway, I'm here today to inform you about environmental justice and the CRC's failure to adequately consider the impacts to our community and alternatives or mitigation measures. The Hayden Island manufactured home community is ground zero. The staging ground will likely be our fence line. Despite the presence of 1,400 residents, mostly low income, in close proximity to the major construction, CRC has refused to acknowledge that we are an EJ community, environmental justice community, deserving of greater consideration in violation of federal regulations. The CRC has failed to analyze the impacts of air toxins from construction despite EPA telling them to do so. The CRC has failed to analyze the impacts from the displacement of the local Safeway, our only source of fresh fruit and prescription medications. The target is not an acceptable replacement, and the CRC has ignored the impacts to our residents, many of whom have limited mobility and may rarely leave the island. CRC has fully considered the need to provide community enhancements to offset the many quality of life impacts we will experience. Most of our residents love our community and want to be here for the rest of our lives. But what will the quality of our lives be with this project for the next decade plus? Enough is enough. It's time for a new plan. There are 4 alternative ideas that need to be looked at. You've seen, I think, almost all of them here today. They would all have a much lower impact on our livability, and I want to thank you all for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you.
Ron Buell was the founding editor and publisher of Willamette Week, was director of strategic planning for Nike, and has written a book on transportation, and I know of no human being who cares more about the livability and viability of this community, and he is the one who gave me these times, so I'm holding him to 7 minutes.
I cut about half of my remarks, so I shouldn't be okay. I wanted to say something on behalf of John Charles.
Can you state your name first?
My name is Ron Buell.
Thank you.
And John is, he broke his nose playing volleyball. And he had his surgery last night at 5 o'clock last night, and he's still on pain meds, so he couldn't come today. And he was going to talk about light rail, and I think address some of the things that Matt Wand has brought up during your hearings. And I just want to say a couple of things about what he was going to say. The light rail line will be on the yellow line, which goes out interstate now and when they build the station at Hayden Island, there'll be 10 stops between Vancouver and downtown Portland. And the trains today run at an average speed of less than 13 miles an hour. And so the trip from Hayden Island to downtown Portland, Chris Strickler said it would be 38 minutes. That would be from the closest of the 3 Vancouver light rail stations. There'll be $176 million spent for 3 big parking garages that people are supposed to drive from Ridgefield and from La Center and from North Vancouver and from Kalama. They're gonna drive to these parking garages and park and get on that light rail line and go to their job. Well, I'm sorry, but the 37% of the trips that in 2030, the traffic modeling year, they say will go across the bridge on light rail seems a little bit of wishful thinking about getting people out of their cars, even though there will be tolls. And so John was comparing it to the 16 minutes that it takes on the express bus, and saying, wow, after you get to where you're going on the light rail, you may still have another trip to your work, and 38 minutes is not time competitive with driving or with those 10 stops on the line. So he was going to raise those questions, and I thought it's only fair to go over them quickly for you. I'd like you to look at the first page of the document that I handed out. It says our resolution and that we're requesting from you. I think you've heard a lot of testimony today. You've got a little bit more coming. We're suggesting that you have a resolution to the Oregon Transportation Commission, to the governor, and to your legislative leadership. And this is what we think you should include in that resolution. No more Oregon money spent on planning for the current CRC project. no acquisition of property or easements, no foot in the door tactics. A bi-state study of affordable alternatives by a new body that would have its recommendations done by February 1st, 2013. So please examine the underlying logic for our resolution. First, on stopping the planning money, the project says it's spent $145 million in the last 6.5 years, about $65 million of that coming from Oregon. A little bit of federal money in there. The Oregon money has come directly from transportation operating funds. These have been discretionary funds that have not required legislative approval. Our state funds could have gone for real construction projects. The project says it is spending $1.9 million a month now, but has $60 million more already allocated to it by the 2 transportation commissions. And we're saying stop the bleeding now. I know when I worked at Nike, I ran some big projects there, and if I had worked for 6.5 years and spent $145 million and had no assured financing for what I was proposing, I would have been fired. So why do we desire to stop the acquisitions of properties and easements? Because there will be 916 permanent jobs displaced by this project, according to the FEIS. And the 300 properties that will be taken have considerable property value on the rolls. No foot in the door tactics, we're saying. Please, let's not let them use some of that $60 million to begin to acquire properties and easements. Our third recommendation, a quick study of affordable alternatives, needs context. The alternatives that will be presented following my remarks, and I'm including George Crandall, who had to leave early, were not thoroughly considered by the DOTS or by the DOTS hand-picked 39-member advisory group. In 2007, a version of what we call the common sense alternative was asked by Metro by majority vote to be included in the environmental impact statement. The request was turned down by the DOTS. The third bridge now that Sharon Nassett will present has long been on Oregon and Washington transportation maps, and there's been a lot of study work done on it. A new bridge for high-speed rail that Brad Perkins will present is part of the Washington State high-speed rail plan, for which Washington received $750 million of federal money. Amtrak is currently planning hourly trains between Portland and Seattle. So just why is this CRC issue a legislative issue for your committee? After all, it went through all those local governments. Well, first, it's because it's the largest public works project ever proposed in the Portland region, and there's no assured money from any source at this time. What's assured is that you're going to be asked to raise the gas tax by $450 million in the next session of the Oregon State Legislature. It seems to me that your colleagues in the legislature would want to know that you've done your due diligence before coming to them with such a request. We're asking you to insist on a look at affordable alternatives that do the job better, cheaper, and faster. Shouldn't this be part of your due diligence as an oversight committee? So your fellow legislators are also going to want to know about the impact of this project on projects they care about in their districts. Maybe it's the Eddyville bypass. Maybe it's the Newburgh-Dundee bypass. Maybe it's widening Highway 217, which is a virtual parking lot at rush hour. Maybe it's the Sunset Parkway needed to connect Highway 26 to I-84. Face it, with gas tax diminishing and the federal trust fund broke, this huge project is going to eat up everything in its sight. It occurs to us that you might be concerned that if you passed our resolution, you'll be blamed for stopping all those federal funds coming this way. To that we say, get real. The CRC has been trying for 6.5 years to get federal commitments for construction, and all it has is a big goose egg. This deficit-conscious Congress is not passing anything this year for infrastructure. And anyone who tells you they can predict what the 2013 Congress is going to do is blowing smoke. And it seems important to me to remind you that neither congressional representative in whose district this project sits, that's one Democrat and one Republican, is an advocate for this particular project. With that, I'd like to tell you the 7 items that all of the presenters of alternatives, and Will Mock, who has a Twin Bridge alternative, is not presenting it. You heard from him earlier. I'd like to go over what we all agree on, all of us. So we're opposed to do nothing. That's not the right answer here. Traffic congestion and freight mobility are real problems. The CRC will not solve those traffic congestion and freight mobility problems, but our recommendations to you, these alternatives that need studying, they will make progress on both. The existing bridges on I-5 have at least 50 to 100 years of life remaining, are solid and safe, and can be seismically upgraded. By aligning the lifts in the BNSF Real Bridge, most lifts on I-5 would disappear. Building an additional road and rail bridge across the Columbia with vehicle lanes would free up freight capacity on the very congested BNSF Railroad. And finally, none of our alternatives call for tolls.
Gerald Fox is a retired transportation engineer who has worked on numerous projects directly relevant to today's subject, including the Mount Hood Freeway and traffic studies and light rail design in many cities.
Sorry, Patrick. I get a full screen. Thank you.
The fundamental problem with the CRC project is that the capacity of I-5 is limited by a series of choke points.
Can you state your name, please?
Gerald Fox.
Thank you.
The fundamental problem with the CRC project is that the capacity of I-5 is limited by a series of choke points. Fix one and the next one gets worse. Fix them all and it'll cost billions and billions of dollars, and the resulting deluge of traffic will gridlock the entire region. According to an independent consultant, at Victory Boulevard, where 6 southbound lanes reduced to 3, I-5 will be full the year the CRC opens. And it won't do much better at several other choke points, such as the 405 merge, the Rose Quarter, and the merge at the Markham Bridge. Congestion at the Columbia River is made much worse by concentrating all of the cross-river traffic on a single facility. The existing I-5 bridge carries around 7,000 person trips in the peak hour, including bus passengers. A big part of the problem is the local traffic using the bridge just to cross the river, thereby impeding the flow of through traffic. The bridge is full. The CRC proposes to solve this by building a bigger bridge. The extra lanes will certainly reduce local traffic friction. Transit and bike use will provide a major boost in capacity, but those choke points are still going to be there. The CRC will be congested the day it opens. And so much for those toll projections that traffic will increase. However, the light rail and bike components will have some reserve capacity so that the CRC will still be operating around about 80% of its person trip capacity. And then it'll be time to start these studies all over again. The common sense alternative is something that I look on as a concept. It's a menu of smaller, more manageable projects that together would address all of the expectations contained in the CRC purpose and need, such as adding capacity by encouraging alternative modes of transportation, which is already a regional policy, dispersing rather than concentrating travel thereby reducing impacts and avoiding the need for all those gigantic new interchanges, improving traffic, safety, and freight access to the ports, and controlling costs. The CRC is far too expensive. Incremental improvements could be made according to priorities and funding availability, with each increment contributing to a better transportation system. Look at the trip hours, the trip distribution for the alternatives. On the right, you have the three components of the CSA. The first one would be the existing freeway bridge, which would have seismic retrofits, and the deferred safety improvements could be completed. Traffic would still be limited by the choke points, but local traffic would divert to more convenient routes. The existing 6 lanes of through traffic would much better match the existing 6 lanes on the approaches. The bridge would probably be operating around about 90% capacity. A new supplemental bridge would connect the Vancouver and Portland street systems via Hayden Island. Local traffic would no longer have to negotiate 2 massive interchanges just across the river. The supplementary bridge would carry transit, local traffic, high-quality bike facilities, and also microcars, those small vehicles that are presently banned from the CRC. This bridge would probably attract around about 5,000 peak hour trips, mostly on transit and bikes, and operate something in the region of 60% of capacity. The WDOT's Cascade Rail Plan calls for an hourly express train between Portland and Seattle. The existing rail bridge would be improved and a new rail bridge constructed to provide capacity for growing rail traffic. Cascade service is expected to attract around about 400 peak hour passengers. And if you add in commute rail service, it might attract another 1,000 to 1,500 peak hour trips, depending on the service offered. In addition to that, for about the cost of one of those enormous CRC interchanges, traffic lanes could be included on the new rail bridge, thus providing a direct connection for trucks between Mill Plain Boulevard in Vancouver and Marine Drive in Portland via Hayden Island. This freight link would allow truck traffic to avoid congestion around the CRC and choose a variety of routes between the port facilities and I-5, depending on conditions and the destination of the trucks. Truck traffic would not need to use Hayden Island interchange at all. If you add in the local traffic, bikes and microcars, and the rail truck bridge would carry something in the region of 4,000 peak hour trips, which is about 50% of its capacity. So if you add all of these things up, you get an interesting chart. It shows the existing I-5 carrying about 7,000 trips a day. The CRC, which will probably be carrying about 11,000 and be close to capacity. The highway portion would be at capacity. And then you see the CSA, which because of its spread and dispersion of traffic has far more capacity and has a significant reserve for future growth. To conclude, the CRC project fails to address the real transportation needs of the region. It will not relieve highway congestion. It may even make congestion worse. And by the time it's finished, it'll be time to start all over again. The CRC will divert funds from alternative modes and from dozens of local safety and capacity projects all over the state. All of the benefits claimed by the CRC can be accomplished by alternatives that cost less, can be built faster, have less impacts, and provide a greater capacity reserve for future growth. Which is why so many concerned citizens have come forward in support of this nonpartisan effort to confront the CRC behemoth and try to head off this looming transportation catastrophe. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for this panel? Yes, Co-Chair Byer.
Just to be real clear, you mentioned a rail bridge. I think it's a rail bridge combined with the truck bridge, a new local bridge, and enhancing or retrofitting the existing bridge. So that would be
right.
2 new bridges that would be built.
Right.
In addition to changes to the existing rail bridge.
Right.
So we'd be looking at in that span there over Hayden Island 4 bridges then.
3 probably.
Well, I was including the existing I-5 bridge.
Okay, yeah, that's correct. But the big difference is that, for instance, the local traffic bridge goes from the existing street system to the existing street system. It doesn't require huge interchanges. It doesn't concentrate major quantities of traffic. And so the cost is far, far less.
But they all would have to have a drawbridge or lift bridge configuration?
That
with
would
it?
depend on the outcome of the present negotiations with the Coast Guard. They could all be handled with a fixed bridge unless there is a very significant increase in height requirements, in which case they would have a lift span, which in fact would save money because a lower bridge with a lift span is less expensive than a high-level bridge because of the long approaches.
Have you considered, or has it been considered, the build-ups to get across the river on the additional bridges and what the impact would be on land on either side?
Well, at this point, there's been no studies of this because all the money has gone to the other guys.
Thank you.
I think it was Representative Ayer first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Buell, you tend to sit in these meetings often and the whole length, and I imagine going back for years and years, you've been sitting in Portland City Council, Metro meetings, Planning Commission meetings, if that's true. So can you tell me, based on what you've been hearing in the recent year on CRC, as we've been getting up to the final EIS and then these legislative oversight committees, do you believe the information as presented to us, the public, and us, the legislature, has been accurate and persuasive? Does the information coming out now agree with what you've observed over the years?
Well,
and Mr. Buell, if I may, we're targeting 12:30 to give ODOT a chance to rebut. So just a very just suggesting that we keep it concise.
Yes, sir. Everywhere we went, we ran into the state's paid lobbyists. Tom Markgraf, who was paid more than $1 million, and David Parisi, who was paid $1.4 million. Markgraf started in 2005, and he lined up the Oregonian, which has now written 35 editorials on it. Fred Meyer is part of the reason there. The Portland Business Alliance and the AFL-CIO and its building trades councils. We knew about the project by the time we got there. It was pretty much a done deal. And that's what I found in these meetings. And the CRC has basically been jammed through without any substantial changes, riding on this wave that Markgraf and Parisi created back in 2008. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Representative Wand and then Representative Sheehan. Oh, I'm sorry, wasn't Representative Wand. Representative Doherty, then Representative Sheehan, and Representative Wand, did you have a question?
Yes, I do.
No, we do it in order. Representative Wand, go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Fox, so I'm interested in your experience in the Mount Hood Freeway. And in particular, I'm aware that that was a project that had been planned for quite some time and then was abandoned. Were you a part, briefly, were you a part or aware of the decision-making process when they shifted gears? And could you describe for me a little bit what that looked like?
Yes. I was part of the consultant team that was working for the Highway Department on the development of the Mount Hood Freeway. And as the work progressed, it became clear that there was nowhere for the traffic to go when it got to Portland here. In the initial stages, this was before the Markham Bridge was built. This was supposed to feed into Markham Bridge. Then the bridge was built. It was full of traffic the day it opened, and it was quite clear that feeding 6 more lanes of traffic into a congested bridge was not going to work. And so the Mount Hood Freeway project did a quick shuffle and said, don't worry, we'll build another Markham Bridge next to it, and we'll feed it in on the other side of the river, except that doesn't work either. And so they were stuck with a project that was technically unsupportable, and eventually it collapsed. But by the time it collapsed, they had been buying and demolishing houses out in the East County. It was a very messy procedure. And this is one of the reasons that we've come before you today to say, let's not do that again. We should learn from it.
Thank you.
Representative Doherty.
The one question I have, and I'm certainly not a math expert, I don't think any of you have really shown, even with Mr. Courtwright's presentation, how 3 bridges are going to be less expensive than one. First of all, Mr. Buell, let me finish. And then second of all, the congestion issues in Portland and on that corridor are not necessarily the current bridge itself, but it's all of the stuff, not only, I mean, all the way down to the Tigard interchange. That is a congestion issue, a pollution issue. And so my question is, first of all, I can't understand how 3 bridges are going to be cheaper than 1, especially when one of those bridges is a railroad bridge. And then second of all, I don't understand where congestion is still going to be an issue, which translates into air pollution, correct? So those are my 2 questions.
So I can answer the first one about the cost. Where the road rail bridge would go across, the new road rail bridge that is proposed in the CSA, or the bridge that Brad Perkins will talk about next, where those things happen, the river is 531 feet shorter across. Those will be, the highway portions will be arterial bridges. They don't need to be as low as the CRC because of the FAA, and if they have a lift in them, they can be lower and less expensive. So that's the answer.
I have one question. What about the neighborhoods on either side?
Well, the bridge that goes across between Hayden Island and downtown Vancouver has, I mean, it's an arterial road. The entry in Vancouver, there will be some traffic on a road that goes up to the port there, and there are some commercial businesses there, and there would probably need to be some improvements to lessen the impact of going from the river up to the street that goes into the port through some neighborhoods. So the answer is yes. And that's why these things need to be studied, and we need to make the best decision about how to proceed for the amount of money.
Can I add to that?
Representative Sheehan.
Can I add?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Mr. Fox, I'm sort of looking at the demand here for through traffic, and in 20 years, it doesn't look like it moves a whole lot. I'm wondering what sort of data you used to decide how much local traffic was going to be still using the existing I-5 bridge and how much would use the new bridge, and with 90% capacity, are we just going to be in the same spot in 20 years?
I think that's part of what I was saying, is that if we don't rebuild I-5 all the way through Portland, we're not going to get any more capacity for through traffic. And so in order to meet travel demand, we have to develop alternatives. And that, the chart here shows how those alternatives would be distributed. The through traffic on the freeway is unlikely to change unless you rebuild the freeway. There's no room in the peak hour. The local traffic will divert to more convenient routes if you provide more convenient routes. And so the bridge performance will improve. But a significant part of this, if you look at the colors on this chart, is the transit component, the local traffic component, and the amount of bike travel that you'll get if you put in a high-quality bike facility. Portland's sustainability plan calls for 25% bike use, which I think is pretty optimistic. However, a number of trips across the river are susceptible to bike use, particularly if you have tolls on the highway and people are going from Vancouver to Hayden Island or from North Portland to Clark College, those kind of trips. And that's how this works.
Thank you.
Further questions for this panel? Seeing none, thank you very much, gentlemen. Mr. Smith, who do you have next?
Mr. Chair, with your permission, Will Mock tells me that he has a more responsive answer to Representative Doherty's question. So if it were possible to just give him a moment to answer the question, I think you'll get
If I may, let's get our witnesses, because we
Okay,
have 5
we can do
witnesses
that.
left.
I think
Let's-
if you send all the information to the committee, that'll be helpful, and a lot of quantitative data on that, because I'm just not buying it.
Yeah. Our last witnesses are Brad Perkins and Sharon Nassett. Mara Gross, Policy Director for the Coalition for a Livable Future, in the interest of time, has waived her presentation, for which we are grateful. And we will ask Brad and Sharon to please come up. And where is Sharon? There she is. Good. Brad Perkins is holder of a U of O degree in architecture, owns and manages a number of businesses in design, preservation, development, and real estate. He is presently a candidate for Metro 5, District 5 Councilor, not, I should mention, against Bob Stacy.
Okay. Well, thank you. With sincere respect, I want to thank you for setting aside the time to listen to what I and 16 other committed citizens are presenting to you today as an alternative plan for the Columbia River crossing. My partner and colleague who has played an integral part in developing this innovative, valuable, and cost-saving CRC alternative plan is Rudy Niederer, a retired Swiss industrial engineer who proposed the concept plan for the light rail system now being built in Honolulu, Hawaii. Rudy and I are among the majority of Northwest environmentally conscious citizens who support a more sustainable solution for the CRC, which will create more jobs and cost less to develop.
And Ms. Perkins, I'm not sure I had you state your name.
Oh, Brad Perkins. Thank you. Over the past 3 years, we have worked together on a conceptual plan for an exclusive double-track, high-speed rail corridor between Eugene and Vancouver, Washington. From Eugene to Tualatin, the HSR tracks are in the middle of the I-5 corridor. The exclusive corridor between Tualatin and the Rhodes Corridor and the Rhodes Corridor to Vancouver, Washington will both have long-distance high-speed rail and commuter rapid transit. This brings us to the issue of the Columbia River crossing. All attempts to avoid dealing with the CRC in our rail planning efforts failed. Every bureaucrat and politician has been burdened with this 800-pound gorilla of a bridge, and no one wanted to hear about a practical alternative, even though the project was too expensive, destructive, and not in the best interests of the public. We eventually decided to look at the CRC as an opportunity to maintain the existing I-5 bridge and combine both road and heavy rail needs by proposing a new Cascadia multimodal bridge located 1.3 miles downriver west of the existing BNSF rail bridge. A number of studies have recommended a new rail bridge over the Columbia River, including Washington DOT Amtrak study. It is also obvious that any development for a new port terminal at West Hayden Island will force the need for a new passenger rail bridge because of the freight train capacity limitations on the existing circa 1903 rail bridge. The bridge can be engineered to be a Coast Guard height approved of 138 feet between the low point of the bridge and the river. It could be built similar to the existing Fremont Bridge, with the upper deck having 4 lanes for two-way vehicular traffic and the bottom deck having 4 rail tracks, 2 tracks for freight rail and 2 tracks for both intercity passenger rail service and commuter rail transit service to transport people between Fourth Plain Boulevard in Vancouver and the Rose Corridor in 7 minutes. The closer you look at how both existing rail and road transportation systems tie into the new Cascadia multimodal bridge, the more you realize that you are simply reinforcing existing freight and passenger transport arteries without having to buy extra property, disrupt businesses, eliminate jobs, destroy infrastructure, and cost billions of extra dollars. And no tolls, okay? Slide 5. Let's take a look at the new commuter rail station between the Fourth Plain Boulevard Viaduct or BNSF Yard, which will also act as the interchange for car and truck traffic. The interchange would converge at the existing viaduct height so that that traffic could connect to I-5 via 4th Plain, Mill Plain, Fruit Company Road, and Northwest 78. This main transportation artery across Columbia River would most assuredly remove congestion off of I-5 because of the reliable and fast commuter rail connections to other transportation systems at the Rose Corridor. It would also attract car and truck traffic from adjacent Vancouver and North Portland neighborhoods and ports. At Hayden Island, the taller rail flyover becomes the lower deck of the bridge with the possibility of on and off ramps for car and truck transport to existing streets on Hayden Island. Notice that the Marine Drive interchange, a proposed widening of Portland Road to 4 lanes, would allow a direct north-south route to and from the new Cascadia Bridge. Proposed new access streets from Marine Drive would also allow easy transition to the bridge for traffic heading north, shortcutting the need to use the I-5 bridge crossing. Columbia Boulevard is already a major truck and car route through North Portland. An improved interchange with ramps connecting North Portland to Columbia Boulevard will make for easy transition. North Portland lines up nicely with the cut for rails going south, offering a future Portland Road extension to Highway 30 via a drawbridge over the Willamette River, and thus avoiding truck traffic and pollution in the town of St. John's. Let me quickly just take you through the remaining exclusive corridor for high-speed rail and commuter rapid transit to the Rose Corridor. The tracks are still elevated over the congested north, south, east, west crossing at Columbia Boulevard and do not travel on the ground until they travel through a double tunnel in North Portland above an existing Union Pacific tunnel. Leaving the eastern edge of the Union Pacific Albina Yard, the double tracks converge to a single track and elevate to a flyover in the Albina Heavy Industrial District until reaching the new Rose Corridor Transportation Center. Commuters at this point will have the option to connect to Max lined buses, Portland streetcar, and 4 other street, bike, and pedestrian corridors. All of what I have presented is exciting to imagine how much economic development could occur with the proper connections of various transportation systems. New rapid transit commuter stops in West Vancouver, Rose Corridor, and Tualatin could create new town centers nearby. New high-speed rail stops at I-5 bus-supported interchanges in Salem, Albany, and near University of Oregon's campus in Eugene could also spur new development. Finally, and most important, is a feasible approach to pay for the first and most critical phase of a much improved passenger and freight rail system with a major new artery and bridge for car and truck movement over the Columbia River. With a concept of shared use and shared costs, you seek matching money from freight rail companies, federal high-speed rail funds, and lease fees to help pay for this less expensive Cascadia multimodal bridge. And let me just conclude by saying that this is a network system, okay, that's connected for the benefit of freight rail, freight trucks, cars, passenger rail. It's all packaged in one way to get over the bridge. And if they want to continue the light rail to Hayden Island, that's certainly a possibility, and include local traffic on that same little bridge. And I thank you for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins.
Sharon Nassett is Board Member and Transportation Committee Chair of the North Portland Business Association, creator of the Economic Transportation Alliance, and founder of Third Bridge Now.
Thank you very much, Chair Benz and Chair Breyer, for putting this together, and all the other members for coming. I have had a really technical PowerPoint that was done for you that talked and moved and everything, and I could just sit here, and it doesn't work with your computer system. It's too new.
Sharon, can you state your name?
Oh, I beg your pardon. For the record, my name is Sharon Nassett. In the back of the blue folder that I just handed out is the PowerPoint that I was going to be speaking from. And it starts out with looking at a beautiful, It starts out talking about a beautiful brand-new bridge adjacent to the rail bridge, the current rail bridge that we have. The bridge would attach, or this is a brand-new freeway, I should say, and we're going to pull up a map here, and I guess we're not going to pull up a map here. Is it this map? Yes, sir, it is. Yes. The handout in the center actually is different information and isn't the PowerPoint, but that will give you an idea. So in looking at this map, it attaches to I-5 as a brand new freeway. Goes into the corridor, goes into the port of Vancouver and Fruit Valley Road, removing traffic off of 4th Plain, Mill Plain, and 39th, and giving Fruit Valley Road and the Port of Vancouver brand new freeway access. It goes south across Jansen Beach on bare, vacant, publicly owned land, giving them a second bridge and providing local opportunity back and forth between the areas. It continues across to Marine Drive, one of the most significant corridors for freight in our area. Currently, traffic backs up past this area every day. It goes down around Smith and Bybee Lake, the majority of that bare, vacant, and publicly owned. Publicly owned land is able to be used as part of our matching federal dollars. It crosses across to Willamette, crosses the Willamette River to near Lenton, giving the Rivergate area a brand new freeway exit back and forth. What happens is it removes the truck traffic in downtown Vancouver, Jansen Beach, and off the St. John's Bridge. So in going back to this PowerPoint, now that you are looking at this picture, it meets all of the purpose and need. And as I said, it goes into the Port of Vancouver. It is multimodal with bike and pedestrian access so that you can also have lower impact vehicles on a bike and ped area next to it. It also includes heavy rail. As you know, heavy rail, commuter, and freight are used with New Start's dollars, which means they are in competition with light rail. However, the heavy rail does a lot more work. It brings us jobs. So when you look at the areas on the 4th slide, it shows Rivergate, Port of Portland, Smith and Bybee Lake, Lenton, and Marine Drive, Columbia Boulevard. At the bottom of that picture, it shows Swan Island. This would connect Swan Island, which currently has a moratorium and cannot continue growing because it has one way on and off through the neighborhood, which is going. By giving it a brand new freeway entrance from I-5 and I-405 at the southern end, and from the northern end of I-5, that means all of the truck traffic out in the center area and all of the residents now have an immediate way to get onto the freeway and removes them off of the neighborhood streets. This will save millions and millions of dollars. In St. John's, we have 2,700 18-wheelers that cross over the St. John's Bridge daily. We have 75% of them have no destination or origin on our peninsula. 26,000 vehicles a day cross the St. John's Bridge, and our total population is less than 12,000 people. We are in the 2% worst air quality of the nation. By creating this bypass and providing access to our ports and industrial areas, we will have a 21st century that will bring jobs here. When you locate in an area such as our ports and industrial areas, you can access other funds, Tiger grants and others. And since my time is at the end, I have a written statement which is, by your PowerPoint, and I'll give it a try. It is important to know that this alternative was accepted into the CRC NEPA process in 2005. The CRC staff arbitrarily and without notification significantly changed its features and definitions of our project. Staff misrepresented it when they presented it to the CRC task force, elected officials, and the public. What was presented by the CRC staff was not what had been submitted. On the scheduled date to reveal the alternative, March 22nd, 2006, staff presented an altered bridge influence area. As a result of the narrowing the study area, most reasonable and viable alternatives were removed without going through the NEPA process. When CRC staff was confronted about the duplicity and presented with data and facts about the true bridge influence area, they chose to rename it the project area and ignored their misconduct. Despite continual requests, CRC staff has failed to follow the requirements of an open NEPA process that requires all reasonable alternatives thoroughly studied and added into the process if identified up until the FEIS becomes record of decision. I therefore am asking this committee to right the wrong and provide an honest, transparent process. The heart of the NEPA process is thorough study of all reasonable alternatives to avoid any narrowing of a process that would exclude reasonable alternatives for comparison. The NEPA process was founded by our 1968 Civil Rights Act. I am asking this committee to recommend to the governors, the state legislators, and the CRC that no money is spent on developing the current alternative until reasonable alternatives, including those adjacent to the rail bridge, have been thoroughly studied so that a complete NEPA process has taken place. Thank you for your immediate attention on this action.
Mr. Chair, that concludes our group. I'm wondering if the committee had any general questions they wanted to ask of the group before we.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. We actually have 3 more people that want to testify in line with what your group has already suggested. So since we're running short of time, does this panel have some questions? Excuse me, does this group have some questions? Yes, Representative Sheehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Oops, there it is. Ms. Nesbitt, I have a question about your designs, and it's a blunt question about credibility.
Yes, sir.
As I'm looking at designs from ODOT, they have some pretty detailed interchanges and plans and very clearly engineering specifications. And the documents that you've provided us look like they're Google Earth images with lines drawn on them. Can you speak to the level of expertise that you employed in doing this, or is this more the work of well-intentioned citizens that have an idea? I'd like to know that there was actual engineers involved that vetted this, because it's a very complicated solution.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Scherer. Actually, the bridge alignments across the Willamette and the Columbia can be found in the Regional Transportation Plan of Oregon from 2000. It is in both states' regional transportation plans and in the Portland Freight Master Plan. The alignment and the idea of following this alignment or something similar to it has been vetted and was recommended for further study in the Southwest Washington Regional Transportation 208 study of visioning corridor. In coming into the NEPA process, that is what they were supposed to provide, is a list of how much it would cost specific to its location and its process and to develop it. And I was told that the NEPA process would be followed, which is you have all alternatives, and if you look here at the very first sheet, it says all reasonable alternatives will be studied. We were brought in during the NEPA process. And then it has a list, and I'll provide it for you, of what thorough is. And that includes the fact that they, according to the Oregon context-sensitive solution, are supposed to be equal in scope. So having entered that process, I should have those exact same drawings done of this project instead of having spent thousands and thousands of dollars from this and the other study book that we have brought forward. And it was removed without the process being followed. So the fact that we do not have that also shows that the NEPA process has not been followed.
So just a very fast follow-up. So the answer to that is no, you didn't have engineers that put this together. This was your group.
I did have engineers look at a benefit analysis study, and I do have that I handed out to you a few months ago, and another copy here that analyzed all of the other studies that have these elements in it and what ones recommended it and how we compared to the Columbia River crossing. As for engineering, it's thousands of dollars, and to tell you the truth, I had to go all the way to Olympia to get an engineering firm that would even do anything on it because so many people here receive their money from ODOT and they consider them to be punitive.
Okay, thank you.
Mr.
Further questions? Nathanson.
Thank you. Very quick, Mr. Perkins, when you say high-speed rail, are you talking about maximum speeds in the 90 to 110 range, or are you talking more bullet train high-speed 150 to 200?
If we're going to be
Real
built,
quick.
if we're going to be building this system for the next 150 years, which I believe it should, it will be built exclusive corridor to go beyond 110 miles an hour. In other words, it will satisfy HSR, high-speed rail qualifications.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And we have three witnesses
Mr.
left.
Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Smith.
On behalf of all of us, we really appreciate the committee's patience with us and all of our being here. One personal comment, a small group of us met with the Senate President some weeks ago, urging a closer look at this, and he asked us, who do you represent? My first response was no one, because nobody in this group is putting beans on their table by the presentation, what they're doing. But in reflection, I later said to him, our grandchildren. And that's why we're here today, for our grandchildren and their grandchildren. And thanks again for the opportunity.
Right, we appreciate the effort in all of the presentations. And with that, because we're running very short of time, Larry Epstein, Walter Valenta, and Jeff Geisler. Gentlemen, I'm going to restrict you each to 3 minutes, and that's because we want to get ODOT up here at least for a few minutes. So I'm much meaner than Mr. Smith, but I'll see if I'm any more fortunate keeping you to your time. So with that, who'd like to go first?
I'm Jeff Geisler. I represent the Hayden Island Neighborhood Network, and I live on Hayden Island in a floating home community. And in the I have a lot of details here. Be handing out a resolution that was passed by high noon, which basically what we want everybody to know is that Hayden Island is not just underneath this huge bridge, but we have lots of other things impacting the island. We've got the mall that's being torn down and rebuilt. We got the Target store. That's, I think, their second largest style of store. Salper Bay on the east end of the island is planning 371 apartments, and that is going to be